Tonight we drift into the quiet mind of the most overlooked Griffin of them all. He doesn't build time machines. He doesn't hijack the plot. But somewhere between the chaos, the yelling, and the fart jokes, Chris Griffin waits. Forgotten, strange, and maybe, just maybe, a little more than anyone ever noticed. So get comfortable, breathe deeply, and let's begin. It's easy to forget Chris Griffin. Not because he's quiet, he isn't. Not because he's dumb, well, okay, a little. But because Chris exists in the in-between. The Griffin family is loud by design, engineered chaos. You've got Stewie, the sentient baby with a space laser ego. You've got Meg, the emotional punching bag. Peter, the living embodiment of a car crash in a bathrobe. And Lois, who runs on caffeine, resentment, and precisely 14 grams of maternal instinct. Somewhere in that tornado, Chris simply floats. There are photos on the wall in the Griffin house. Some are cracked, some are crooked. One frame just holds a napkin. Peter once drew a frowny face on and called family. Chris's baby picture? It's behind the fridge. No one knows how it got there. It fell off the wall one day and never got picked up. Chris walked past it for years, glanced down at it, smiled softly, and moved on. That's Chris. He was the second born, or maybe the third. Honestly, the timeline's a bit slippery. The show itself can't seem to remember, and neither can Peter. Peter once said Chris was probably adopted from one of those grocery store sweepstakes. Lois corrected him, but didn't remember the hospital name. There was screaming, she said, and a lot of soft jazz. Chris' first word was lamp. That tracks. His second word was please. No one heard it. It came during dinner one night when Meg was crying because Peter had replaced her school books with bricks, and Stewie was threatening to assassinate Elmo. Chris said please, hoping someone would pass the potatoes. No one passed them. In fact, the family forgot to make potatoes that night. Chris ate a napkin and went to bed humming. In school, Chris was labeled a non-disruptive presence. Not gifted, not troubled, just there. He wasn't the kid setting fire to textbooks, but he also wasn't the one raising their hand with excitement. Chris was the one quietly doodling in the corner, sometimes drawing SpongeBob, other times sketching a hyper-realistic skeleton of the teacher's face. He once drew a mural on the bathroom stall that was so disturbingly beautiful the school assumed it had been done by a visiting artist. Chris was suspended for trying too hard. He never complained. That's the part most people forget. Not once did Chris rage against the dysfunction. Not once did he scream about how invisible he felt. He just smiled, nodded, and drifted from one moment to the next, like a helium balloon with no string. His life was a series of blank spaces filled in by everyone else's noise. Peter treated him like a sidekick, if he remembered he had one. Sometimes he'd call him Chunk, other times Meatball, and once, disturbingly, Mr. Pudding. Chris never corrected him. One Thanksgiving, Peter gave Chris a fork and told him to stand guard over the cranberry sauce. Chris stood there for 4 hours. No one ate the cranberry sauce. Chris considered that a win. Lois was different, not better, just different. She parented in bursts. Sometimes she'd bring Chris a plate of cookies and kiss his forehead and say, "You're my big, strong man, huh?" Other times she'd forget he was even in the room. Once, when he walked into the kitchen wearing a Halloween mask, Lois screamed, threw a meat tenderizer at his head, and yelled, "Intruder!" Chris apologized for startling her. She didn't apologize for the concussion. Still, he loved her. He loved all of them, in that soft, unexamined way that children do before they're old enough to question it. Even Meg, especially Meg. They had a weird bond, the two of them. Not so much camaraderie as shared trauma. They knew what it felt like to be dismissed, stepped over, left out of punchlines and dinner conversations. Once, Chris and Meg sat silently at the dining table, long after everyone else had left, eating cold mashed potatoes and humming the theme song to Cheers. They didn't talk. They didn't have to. Brian, for his part, was vaguely tolerant of Chris. Occasionally, he'd try to give him life advice, usually after 2 glasses of wine and a failed Tinder date. "Listen, kid," Brian slurred once, "life's not about being noticed. It's about noticing. You get that?" Chris nodded. Brian nodded back. They stared at the microwave clock for 47 minutes. Chris's room was never his sanctuary. It was small, warm, and weirdly damp. The wallpaper peeled in the corners. A nightlight shaped like a football hummed loudly enough to disturb sleep, but not enough to justify unplugging. There were 2 posters on the wall, one of a cat hanging from a tree with the words, "Hang in there," and another of Peter, shirtless, from some long-forgotten Dad of the Month contest. Chris never took that one down. He just drew sunglasses on it with permanent marker and called it Vacation Dad. As the years went on, Chris became less of a child and more of a fixture. The couch had a cushion shaped like him. The fridge had a milk jug labeled, "Chris's do not chug." Peter chugged it anyway. Chris just got another jug. At school, people knew who he was, but couldn't quite place why. "Isn't he the one who got stuck in the vending machine?" one kid asked. "Nah, he's the one who made a working jetpack out of pizza boxes," said another. Both were true. The strange thing about Chris was how little he resisted being forgotten. He wasn't angry about it. He wasn't even sad. There was something deeply, peacefully eerie about that. Like a character in a dream who knows they're not the main story and is okay with fading into the background. Chris was the ghost of potential in a house full of noise. But every so often, something would flicker in his eyes, a spark, a flash, a moment where the air around him shifted, just slightly as if the universe remembered he was still there. It usually passed. Someone would yell, something would break, Stewie would threaten nuclear war again. But for that split second, Chris Griffin felt like the still point in the middle of a swirling, ridiculous storm. And maybe that was his real role all along. It's not that Chris Griffin didn't want to be noticed. He just stopped expecting it. Somewhere between learning how to tie his shoes and learning that family dinners were more of a gladiator match than a bonding ritual, Chris made peace with his position. Not the favorite, not the problem, just orbiting, like a moon around a planet that doesn't know it's there. There was a time, brief and nearly mythic, when Chris tried to be the center of attention. He put on a magic show at school. He practiced for weeks. Card tricks, fake flowers, disappearing coins. On the day of the performance, Peter showed up drunk, wearing a cape made of trash bags, and loudly proclaimed himself the great fat Sinai. He fell through the stage before Chris even pulled out his first prop. The school clapped anyway. Not for Chris. Just because Peter breaking something was apparently funny. That was the day Chris quietly gave his magician's hat to a raccoon and never spoke of it again. But for every disappointment, there was a small, strange triumph. Chris once single-handedly stopped a bee infestation in the house by talking to them. No one knows what he said. The bees left. Peter screamed that it was witchcraft and tried to burn the shed down. Lois made Chris apologize to the bees. He did. Then offered them sugar water and said, "You deserve better." The bees didn't come back, but a single jar of honey appeared on his windowsill the next day. He never opened it. So even Stewie, whose ego requires its own gravitational pull, occasionally sensed something odd about Chris. He once caught Chris staring at a blank television screen for 3 hours. "What are you watching?" Stewie asked. "The color's in my head," Chris said. Stewie didn't know how to respond. He backed away slowly, muttering something about spatial anomalies. Chris had a sense of calm that was almost spooky. While everyone else in the house exploded over the tiniest thing, spilled milk, missing remote, the toaster being too loud again, Chris would just sit quietly, peeling an orange or drawing on a napkin. Once a full-blown house fire erupted in the kitchen. Peter was screaming, Lois was trying to swat the flames with a yoga mat, and Stewie was trying to reroute the smoke into Cleveland's house. Chris just walked outside, sat on the porch swing, and hummed the tune to Green Acres. When the fire department arrived, Chris told them, "They'll be fine. They always are." He wasn't stupid, not really. That's the common misconception. Chris is dumb, slow, the family lump. But there's a difference between ignorance and detachment. Chris just seemed to live on a different frequency, one that didn't require a constant reaction. He processed things quietly, internally. When the family fought, he didn't jump in. When they argued about who ate the last pudding cup, Chris already knew it was Brian, but said nothing. Brian knew Chris knew. They made eye contact. Brian left an apology muffin in Chris's sock drawer 2 days later. They never spoke of it. In gym class, Chris was a mystery. He wasn't athletic, but he had moments, flashes of unexpected ability. He once caught a dodgeball behind his back without looking. The coach fainted. Another time, he bench-pressed Principal Shepard by accident. He thought the bar was just a really heavy broom. When asked how he did it, Chris shrugged and said, "I dreamed I could, so I did." Dreams were important to Chris. Not just nighttime dreams, but daydreams, floating thoughts, what-if scenarios. He once told Meg he imagined a world where everyone wore shoes on their hands and never questioned it. She asked why. He said, "Because then no one would expect hugs." That made Meg cry. Chris gave her a paper towel and said, "You can keep this." She still has it in her diary. Sometimes Chris would say things that didn't seem to belong to him. Phrases too poetic, too strange, too pointed. During one particularly bad fight between Lois and Peter, it involved a goldfish, a blender, and Peter's refusal to wear pants ever again, Chris whispered, "Sometimes love sounds like shouting because people forget how to speak softly." Everyone paused. Lois blinked. Peter scratched his stomach. The moment passed. Stewie wrote it down and tried to pass it off as his own in a failed poetry contest. Chris didn't need validation. He didn't seem to expect praise. But every now and then, when no one was looking, he'd beam. Like when he found a perfectly round stone at the beach. He kept it in a sock and named it Gentle Dan. Or when a bird landed on his shoulder and just sat there while he walked home. He told the bird his favorite color was beige. The bird nodded. They parted ways without ceremony. The thing is, Chris Griffin might not want to be the center of the story. He might be perfectly content being the soft background hum of it, the gentle bass note under all the screeching and slapstick and vulgarity. While Peter blows things up, Meg cries in her room, Stewie plots and Brian spirals, Chris is the one humming in the hallway, carrying a drawing he'll never show anyone, on his way to make a sandwich no one asked for. And yet, every once in a while, the universe nudges us to notice him. A subtle shift. A quiet reminder that not all stories are loud. That sometimes the most haunting lore lives not in laser battles or interdimensional chaos, but in the boy who smiled at bees and drew a door on his bedroom wall just in case he ever needed to leave. And maybe one day he will. Chris Griffin's world wasn't filled with loud declarations or existential breakdowns. It moved in stillness, odd little rituals, and the quiet understanding that nobody was really listening. And yet he paid attention. That's the secret about Chris. He saw everything. He just didn't always know how to respond, or if anyone cared about the answer if he did. In the Griffin house, you had to fight for space, verbally, emotionally, and sometimes physically. Stewie yelled to be heard. Meg pleaded to be acknowledged. Peter just shouted because it made his brain feel fizzy. But Chris watched, observed, absorbed. He'd sit at the edge of conversations, nodding slowly, blinking a little too long, as if uploading everyone's nonsense into a folder marked, "They won't remember this, but I will." Lois once said, "Chris is a good boy. He just doesn't sparkle." That was during a parent-teacher conference when the school informed her Chris had stopped speaking entirely during math class and instead spent every period folding his test paper into origami ducks. When asked why, Chris said, "Because they don't ask for answers, they just exist." The teacher gave him a C+ out of confusion. He never got in trouble. Not really. Not in the way that drew headlines. There was a long stretch of time where no one could explain how the toaster kept turning up with a slice of buttered Pop-Tart inside it every morning. No one made them. No one bought them. They just appeared. Quietly, reliably. For weeks. Eventually, Stewie set up a camera. The footage showed Chris in the dark at 4:12 a.m., gently sliding a single Pop-Tart into the toaster, patting it once, and vanishing into the hallway like a ghost in boxers. Stewie never brought it up. The Pop-Tarts stopped soon after. And that's how it usually went. Chris would do something strange, something oddly precise or unsettlingly sweet, and then fade back into his own slow rhythm before anyone could really process it. He once left a glass of water beside Meg's bed every night for 2 weeks after she had a fever. She never noticed. When she did, she asked Peter if he was doing it. Peter said, "Gross. Why would I hydrate her?" and went back to watching YouTube videos of dolphins getting kicked. Chris didn't expect recognition. He barely seemed to need it. But every now and then, the absence weighed on him. He'd walk into the living room, say, "Hi," and get 3 simultaneous responses. Lois would say, "Hi, Meg." Peter would shout, "Pass the remote," even if Chris wasn't near it, and Stewie would mutter, "Here comes sentient oatmeal again." Chris would just nod. Then go make a sandwich no one asked for. His sandwiches were a thing of mystery. Not because of the ingredients, though those were often puzzling, but because of the care he put into them. One sandwich had 3 layers of grilled cheese, separated by a layer of cold spaghetti and 1 perfect slice of apple. Another was peanut butter, pickles, and cinnamon toast. Once he made a silent sandwich, nothing inside, just 2 slices of bread, and a note that said, "For later when noise feels like too much." He wrapped that one in wax paper and put it under the couch. Brian found it 3 weeks later and quietly put it back. There was a stretch of time when Chris started wearing a helmet around the house. Not for safety, just because it felt right. When asked why, he said, "Sometimes it helps keep my dreams in." No one knew what that meant. Peter wore it once as a joke, said he felt dizzy and cried for 20 minutes. Stewie burned sage over it afterward. Chris just smiled and put it back on the shelf. That's the thing about Chris. His presence was soft, but his weirdness was dense. You had to sit with it, let it unfold. His jokes were often mistimed, his stories a little too slow, his observations strangely profound. Once in the middle of dinner, he said, "Do you think goldfish know they're trapped? Or do they think that bowl is the whole sky?" Peter responded by shoving an entire roll into his mouth. Lois pretended she didn't hear. Meg wrote it in her diary and underlined it twice. It wasn't just the family that misunderstood him. His school barely knew what to do with him either. Chris wasn't disruptive, but he'd do things like sit backwards in chairs and refuse to explain why. Once during science class, he built a tiny sculpture of the solar system out of chewing gum and paper clips. It was so accurate, the teacher thought it was store-bought. When asked how he made it, Chris said, "It came to me in a sneeze." He wasn't bullied in the traditional sense, mostly because the bullies couldn't quite figure him out. He was too tall to pick on comfortably and too unpredictable to mess with. When one kid called him thick for brains, Chris blinked twice and said, "Thanks, I've been working on density." The insult didn't land. The bully just nodded and left. Lunch was his quiet ritual. Chris liked to sit at the corner table under the broken vending machine. Every day he'd line up his food in perfect symmetry, chips, sandwich, fruit, drink, and then eat it in a different order each time. He said it helped him keep his memories from getting bored. Once a teacher tried to join him. Chris said, "You'll have to hum the right tune first." The teacher didn't know what that meant, neither did Chris, but it felt true. At night, Chris talked to the moon. He didn't howl or pray. He just opened his window, looked up, and whispered things like, "I think Dad's chair is evil," or "I wish cereal didn't get soggy so fast." Sometimes he'd pause and ask, "Is this what being alive feels like?" Then he'd sit cross-legged on his floor and draw pictures of animals that don't exist. A horse with butterfly wings, a frog with shoes, once an octopus with a necktie, holding a tiny briefcase labeled Monday. No one ever caught him doing this. But the drawings kept showing up under the fridge or in the mailbox or folded neatly inside cereal boxes. One morning, Lois found a sketch of a bear holding a balloon, standing on a cloud, crying a single tear that said, "I miss the quiet." She taped it on the fridge next to Stewie's report card. Peter drew sunglasses on the bear and said, "Now it's chill." Chris didn't mind. He wasn't fragile, just tuned to a different station. There was something oddly cosmic about him, like if the rest of the Griffins were pieces of a chaotic puzzle, Chris was a square block trying to fit into a round, jagged hole, not realizing he was holding the lid to a completely different game box. His mind was full of colors nobody else used. He wasn't the smartest or the fastest or the most talented, but he was the strangest kind. One summer, he took a job at the local miniature golf course. Not because he loved golf, but because he liked watching people pretend to be patient. He worked the counter, handed out little pencils and golf balls, and offered oddly specific advice to every customer. "Hole 3 always leans left. Don't trust the windmill, it lies. Hole 7 is about forgiveness, not skill. Watch out for squirrels, they've been talking." Nobody ever knew what he meant, but somehow everyone listened. The owner said Chris wasn't particularly efficient, but guests loved him. They'd come back just to hear his takes on gravity or the moral alignment of gnomes. One family gave him a homemade blueberry pie just for being oddly calming. Chris ate it under a tree with a squirrel he named Captain Nibbles. But school always came back. And so did the awkward silences, the teachers not knowing where to place him, the classmates too busy to decode him. One girl tried to ask him out once. She wrote a note. "Do you want to go to the dance with me?" Yes, no, maybe dinosaur? Chris circled dinosaur and drew a tiny T-Rex with hearts for eyes. She never brought it up again. He didn't go to the dance. He stayed home and danced in his room with a broom, wearing a necktie and a helmet. Stewie walked past, paused and muttered, "Honestly, I get it," then shut the door. There was a long week in spring where Chris refused to speak English, not in protest, just because he wanted to see if he could survive using only sound effects and hand gestures. He communicated through chirps, whistles, and the occasional kazoo. It worked for 4 days. Lois gave up and started responding in charades. Meg didn't notice. Peter joined in on day 5 and ruined everything by honking at a police officer. Sometimes It felt like Chris wasn't part of the family at all, but some wandering force that had temporarily taken the shape of a teenager. He'd wander into a scene, say something bizarrely insightful like, "Do shadows get lonely at night?" Then vanish into the background with a sandwich shaped like a question mark. Brian, the dog, had once tried to have a serious talk with him. It was late. Everyone else was asleep. Chris was on the porch staring at a plastic bag caught in a tree. Brian sat beside him and said, "You ever feel like nobody gets you?" Chris nodded. "Yeah, but that's okay. I don't always get me either." Brian blinked. "That's actually kind of beautiful." Chris squinted. "Do you think bugs get embarrassed when we catch them staring at us?" Brian lit a cigarette. "And we're back." There's this mistaken belief that Chris is just the dumb one, that he's the punchline, the background laugh. But in moments like that, between the chaos, under the weird, there was depth, a kind of raw emotional logic, a lens no one else thought to look through. Peter once said, "Chris is like a microwave. You don't know how it works, but you're glad it's there when you're sad and hungry." That might have been the closest anyone got to describing him. Even his dreams were weird. One time he told the family he had a dream where he was a tree in the front yard, and everyone kept tying wishes to him with little red ribbons. "Did the wishes come true?" Lois asked. Chris shrugged. "Some did. One of them asked for quieter clouds." Peter looked around. "Okay. Who asked for quiet clouds? That's how they sneak up on you." Chris never needed to be the center of attention. He just wanted the edges to be soft. He liked when people were kind without needing a reason, when sandwiches stayed symmetrical, when birds landed on the fence and stayed just long enough for him to say hi under his breath. He once wrote a poem on a napkin and left it under the living room lamp. It read, "Sometimes I feel like a cereal box, bright on the outside, crumbs on the inside, missing a prize that maybe was never there." No one claimed it, no one brought it up, but Lois saved the napkin. That was Chris. Present but uncounted, loud in a quiet way, and always, just slightly off-center, like a painting hung too low but too sincere to fix. He didn't ask for much, just a little space, a sandwich no one questioned, and maybe, once in a while, a nod from the moon that said, "Yes, I see you." The Griffin house had its own hum, not the sound of appliances or television static, though those were constant, but a low, invisible frequency of disorder. Chaos didn't erupt in the Griffin home. It brewed quietly, bubbled behind cereal boxes, smoldered inside couch cushions, and occasionally burst into flames when Peter tried to fix the microwave with a hammer and a Twizzler. Chris moved through this chaos like a man wading through water in slow motion. He didn't fight the current. He just accepted it. If the living room exploded into a food fight, he'd wait until it ended, then quietly walk through, covered in mashed potatoes, and ask, "Did anyone save a fork?" That morning, the house was especially loud. Stewie was ranting about interdimensional instability in the laundry room. Meg was crying over something she hadn't explained yet. Peter was stuck halfway into a bucket, yelling, "Lois, I'm being reborn." And Brian was pacing the kitchen, muttering about overdue library books and existential dread. Chris sat at the table eating toast. Burnt. No butter. Just toast. He chewed slowly, blinking at the chaos like it was a documentary he didn't fully understand. Then, without warning, he stood up, put the toast on a plate, and carried it into the backyard. The backyard was its own universe. The grass was uneven. The lawn chairs were rusty. A trampoline leaned suspiciously close to the neighbor's fence. But for Chris, this patch of suburban wilderness was a sanctuary. He placed the toast gently on the edge of the picnic table and whispered, "This is for the birds." Then he sat in the grass, cross-legged, and waited. Not even 5 minutes passed before a crow landed nearby. It stared at the toast, then at Chris, then cawed once, like it had accepted the terms of an ancient agreement. Chris nodded solemnly. The bird took a bite and flew away. Lois watched from the window. She didn't say anything. But later that night, she put a fresh loaf of bread on the shopping list and wrote next to it, "For Chris's friends." At school, things were different. Teachers struggled to place Chris in the right category. He wasn't disruptive. He wasn't failing. But he wasn't thriving either. He floated. During a biology class, the teacher asked, "Chris, can you tell us what DNA stands for?" Chris blinked. "Do not ask." Everyone laughed. The teacher chuckled, but Chris just nodded slowly and said, "Seriously, DNA doesn't want to be bothered. It's busy being everyone." The room went quiet. Then someone dropped a pencil and it all returned to normal. Chris didn't mind being misunderstood. He'd grown used to it. But once in a while, he'd find someone who tilted their head the same way he did. Like Rachel Baxter, a girl in his art class who wore 2 different socks and drew horses with 3 eyes. They didn't talk much. But one day, she leaned over during a charcoal sketching session and said, "Do you ever feel like your dreams are just recycled thoughts from other universes?" Chris didn't blink. He just nodded and whispered, "Yeah. And sometimes I think squirrels are watching to make sure we don't find out." That was the beginning of a very quiet friendship. They didn't hang out at lunch. They didn't text. But sometimes they'd meet at the back of the library and draw things together. Chris would sketch machines powered by feelings. Rachel drew forests made of jelly beans. Once they collaborated on a creature that had antlers made of coat hangers and eyes that glowed when people lied. When Rachel moved away in spring, she left him a sticky note that said, "You're not broken. You're just tuned to a different station. Keep drawing. Keep being weird." Chris kept that note in his sock drawer under the left sock with the dinosaur on it. Meanwhile, back at home, Peter was planning a family outing, an idea that always came with risk. "I got us tickets to the Quahog County Fun Fair," he announced while standing on the kitchen table. "There's a petting zoo, a roller coaster, and a guy who sells fried mayonnaise on a stick." Lois raised an eyebrow. "Isn't that the fair where you got into a fight with the mechanical bull?" "That bull insulted my mother," Peter said. "But it's fine. I made peace with it. I'm bringing a pie." Chris's eyes lit up. "Will there be horses?" "Yep," Peter nodded. "And probably too many ducks." Chris clapped once and smiled. The day of the fair arrived in full Quahog fashion. Meg wore an outfit designed to make her invisible. Stewie came armed with a taser and a juice box. Brian wore sunglasses and tried to blend in with a group of disaffected teenagers. Peter wore a fanny pack and a Let's Get Weird tank top. Chris wore a safari hat and carried a bag of breadcrumbs. At the petting zoo, while Peter got kicked by a goat and Stewie tried to negotiate with a llama, Chris sat quietly next to the pony enclosure. He held out his hand and whispered to the smallest pony, "I see you." The pony blinked slowly and took a step closer. Chris fed it a carrot. For a moment, everything around him, noise, smells, chaos, faded into silence. It was just him and the pony, nodding at each other like 2 old souls passing in a dream. And then Peter accidentally set fire to a hot dog stand and the fair had to be evacuated. Later that evening, after the flames had been put out and the Griffins were banned from yet another public venue, Chris sat on the roof of the house. He didn't say anything, just watched the stars come out one by one. Stewie climbed up beside him, holding a flashlight like a tiny wizard. "You're a strange specimen, Christopher," he said. "Half cloud, half pudding cup, but I respect that." Chris smiled. "Thanks, I think." They sat in silence for a bit. Then Chris pointed to a cluster of stars and asked, "Do you think one of those stars is where all the socks go?" Stewie sipped from his juice box. "I'd wager it's also where most of my sanity fled." Chris nodded solemnly. "Hope they're happy there." Some nights, Chris didn't sleep right away. It wasn't insomnia, not in the clinical sense. It was more like his brain stayed up a little longer than his body, still wandering even when the lights were off. In his room, surrounded by action figures, pencil sketches, and that one lava lamp Peter claimed was haunted, Chris would lie on his back and stare at the ceiling. The glow-in-the-dark stars he'd put up years ago still clung to the plaster, constellations of his own making. He called them things like the burrito whale and Sir Meowington's saddle. Sometimes the stars blinked back. Not literally, of course. But in that hazy space between consciousness and dreaming, anything felt possible. In that space, Chris wasn't the weird kid or the forgotten Griffin. He was just Chris. A soft-edged presence orbiting the noise, steady in a way that never needed explanation. Downstairs, the house muttered to itself. The fridge clicked. Peter snored like a wounded tuba. Lois flipped through a paperback on the couch until sleep took her mid-sentence. Stewie muttered coordinates in his sleep. Brian was awake, sipping something from a mug and pretending not to feel too much. And Chris just floated, until the night he heard the humming. It wasn't the usual house sounds. This was something else, a pulsing, mechanical kind of hum, like a spaceship clearing its throat. Chris sat up, not startled, just curious. He padded down the hall, past Meg's room, where the sound of sad pop music echoed like a wounded ghost. Past Stewie's lair, where an interdimensional rift crackled behind a reinforced door, and then into the attic. No one really used the attic anymore. There were boxes full of VHS tapes, holiday decorations, and that cursed Furby that once tried to marry Peter. But in the corner, under a tarp, something glowed. Chris pulled it back. It was a machine. Sleek humming, covered in candy wrappers and blueprints drawn in crayon. On the front was a note that read, "Do not touch unless you're weird enough to get it. Stewie." Chris tilted his head. Then he touched it. Instantly, the machine whirred to life. Lights blinked. A panel slid open. Steam hissed. And a voice, feminine, robotic, slightly flirty, said, "Welcome, Subject Char 15. Emotional quantum link initiated." Chris didn't flinch. He just smiled and said, "Hi." And then, like flipping through channels in his own subconscious, he was somewhere else. He was in a version of Quahog where everyone wore Victorian outfits and spoke in musical rhymes. Meg was a lamp. Brian was a priest. Peter was still Peter, but with a monocle. He blinked again, and now he was in a pixelated video game world where everything jumped when you did. The houses bounced. Lois threw mushrooms. Stewie chased him in a mech suit shaped like a cat. Another blink. A world made of marshmallow where gravity was optional, and everyone moved like they were underwater. Chris floated past a school made of licorice and waved at a teacher who looked suspiciously like Joe Swanson, but with butterfly wings. Oh, and through it all, he stayed calm. He didn't panic. He didn't scream. He just drifted, observing, smiling, like he was already tuned to the right channel. Then suddenly, just as the world began to fold in on itself like a collapsing pop-up book, he blinked again. Back in the attic. Back in his pajamas. The machine powered down. And Chris, with all the calm of a man who had seen too much and yet not enough, said, "Cool." He didn't tell anyone about the machine. Not because he didn't want to, just because he knew they wouldn't get it. Not really. Instead, he carried the experience like a quiet song only he could hum. It gave him a new kind of energy, a subtle glow. Lois noticed it. Peter didn't. Meg tried to ignore it. Brian raised an eyebrow. Stewie narrowed his eyes and made a note in his evil journal. Chris has touched the reality weaver, monitor, maybe more interesting than previously assumed. The next day at school, Chris raised his hand during history class and asked, "If we're made of atoms, and atoms are mostly empty space, then are we just ghosts in very polite formation?" The teacher stammered. Another student dropped their pen. A girl in the back whispered, "Whoa." At lunch, Chris sat under a tree and fed crackers to a squirrel who'd been visiting him every day for a week. He named it Marvin. Marvin blinked like he understood the rules of the multiverse. And at home, Chris started drawing again. Not doodles, not dragons or tanks or one-eyed frogs, but scenes. He drew the video game world, the marshmallow school, the monocled Peter. He drew a series of creatures he called the quiet thoughts, each one shaped like an emotion he couldn't name. He drew the attic machine and titled it The Whispering Door. Lois framed one of the sketches and put it in the hallway. It made Meg groan, and Peter asked if it was a chicken. But Stewie stopped in front of it one day and just stared. "Fascinating," he muttered. "The boy may be, connected." Connected wasn't the word Chris would have used. And he preferred floaty or maybe dream adjacent. But he didn't argue. Instead, one evening after dinner, while Peter was trying to make a grilled cheese using an iron and a curling wand, Chris turned to Lois and said, "Can I go to the library?" Lois blinked. "The public library?" Chris nodded. She smiled. "Sure, honey, be home before dark." And he was. But not before checking out a book titled The Theory of Parallel Sandwiches, How Everything You've Ever Lost Still Exists Somewhere. He read it in 2 nights, under a blanket, by flashlight, laughing quietly at the parts that weren't supposed to be funny. And when he finished, he closed the book, held it to his chest, and whispered, "Makes sense." Chris held the book to his chest long after the final page had gone quiet. The Theory of Parallel Sandwiches wasn't exactly a bestseller. Half of it read like it had been written by someone in a bathrobe talking to a doorknob. The other half felt like a whisper from something older than time trying to explain things in metaphors made of toast. But for Chris, it made sense. Not logically. Not in the take notes and ace the quiz kind of way. It clicked like deja vu, like remembering something he never knew he forgot. The book said, everything that leaves you still exists somewhere else. He liked that. So the next day, Chris started asking questions, quietly, softly, like he was brushing sand off a fossil. Have you ever sneezed and felt like you slipped into a different version of yourself? He asked Meg at breakfast. She stared at him like usual. What? Chris just smiled. In school, during biology, he raised his hand again. The teacher, Mr. Flinkins, who wore a permanent sweat mustache, sighed. Yes, Chris? If thoughts are electric, then how far do they travel before they turn into dreams? The class went silent. Someone in the back muttered, bros on shrooms. But the teacher paused, thought for a second, then said, that's, not exactly on the quiz. Still, Chris saw the flicker of curiosity, that small, unspoken maybe in people's eyes. It felt good. At lunch, Marvin the squirrel didn't show up. Chris took that as a sign. Not that Marvin was gone, but that he'd slipped into another dimension for a while. Maybe there were Chris Griffins over there, too. versions of him who wore cool boots and spoke in riddles, one who could skateboard without falling, one who Meg actually liked, or maybe one who didn't need anyone else at all to feel real. That night he sketched again. Not just the marshmallow school or the furry priest versions of Brian. This time, he drew a boy made of stars. Same haircut, same belly, same blank stare, but his eyes had galaxies in them. He titled it, Chris from Earth, 19.5, The Boy Who Forgot to Forget. He left it taped on the fridge. Peter took it down to look for coupons behind it. But Lois noticed. "Did you draw this, Chris?" she asked while rinsing a mug. He nodded. "It's something." She smiled, but with that parental distance. She was proud, but only in the way a mom's supposed to be, like applauding politely for a play you didn't understand but know was important to your kid. Chris didn't mind. Because the thing about floating is, you learn not to expect the current to steer you where you want. You just let it carry you. But he did start keeping a journal. It wasn't filled with long rants or teen angst, just thoughts, observations, scribbles that didn't fit on normal paper. Quotes he made up that sounded like something old philosophers would have said if they were really into cartoons and sandwiches. Things like, maybe the moon is just the Earth's weird friend who doesn't like to be touched. People say I'm slow, but clocks are slow too when you're watching them. Sometimes I feel like a background character in my own memory. He didn't share the journal with anyone. Except one night, he left a page folded and slid under Stewie's door. It read, "You think you're the smartest, but smart isn't the same as seeing. I think I see more than I know. Does that make me dangerous or just interesting?" Stewie didn't respond. But 2 days later, Chris found an envelope in his sock drawer. Inside was a small gadget, shaped like a baby bottle labeled temporal eavesdropper, used with discretion, and a note. "Let's call this a mutual interest. Don't lick it. S." Chris didn't lick it. But he did start using it. Not in a creepy way, just to listen in to things around the house. Not conversations. Those were often loud and dumb anyway, but the in-between moments, the murmurs, the sighs, the pauses between what people said and what they meant. He listened to Peter humming Eye of the Tiger while unclogging the sink. He listened to Lois sigh 3 times before hanging up the phone after talking to her mother. He listened to Brian mutter, "You're not a real writer, you fraud," into the bathroom mirror. And Stewie? He just whispered coordinates, numbers, names that didn't exist. Sometimes a laugh that didn't match his baby voice. And through all of that, Chris just listened. It made him feel closer, not in a nosy way, but in that way you feel when you realize other people are just as weird and floating and scared as you. In art class that week, the teacher asked everyone to draw a version of yourself that doesn't exist yet. Most kids rolled their eyes or just drew themselves with muscles or cool hair. Chris drew himself made of fog, sitting on a bench made of ideas, feeding breadcrumbs to invisible birds. The teacher didn't get it, but one girl did. Her name was Lily. She sat behind him and wore oversized hoodies and drew nothing but bats with little smiles. She tapped his shoulder. "I like your bench." Chris blinked. "Thanks. It's made of regret and daydreams." She smiled like that made perfect sense. And for the first time in a long while, Chris felt seen, not just looked at, but understood in that sideways, don't make a big deal about it kind of way. Later, on the bus ride home, she sat next to him and asked, "Do you ever feel like the world's a radio and we're just tuned to the wrong station?" Chris nodded slowly. "All the time." And they sat in silence. Not awkward silence. The good kind. The kind that wraps around you like a blanket, someone who cares tucked in without saying a word. They didn't talk much after that. Chris didn't know what to say, and Lily didn't seem to mind. It wasn't like with Meg, who filled silences with complaints and phone brightness set to 1,000%. And it wasn't like with Peter, who mistook every moment of quiet as an opportunity to sing about food. No, with Lily, the silence was collaborative. By the time the bus reached Spooner Street, Chris felt like he'd just watched a really gentle movie. One with no explosions, no betrayals, just soft music and people understanding each other in weird ways. He waved goodbye. She didn't wave back, but she did smile. That was enough. At home, things were back to their usual noise. Peter was trying to microwave a boot. They said heat molds it to your foot. And Stewie had turned the living room into a staging area for what he called Project Lunar Baptism. There were salt circles. There was Latin. There was Brian reading infinite jest upside down to appear intellectual. Lois yelled from the kitchen, "Chris, dinner in 10, and tell your father not to use the toaster as a shoe rack again." Chris wandered past all of it like he was underwater. Not in a bad way, just in a way that made the house seem a little blurrier than before. Like he was tuned to a different frequency, and everything here was a rerun. Later that night, he lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling where he'd stuck glow-in-the-dark stars years ago. Some had peeled off, others had shifted. Together they formed constellations of places that never existed. There was the hamster night, and the pretzel loop, and his favorite, the watching spoon. He whispered to himself, "One sees everything, but doesn't say a word." As he drifted, he felt a tiny pull, like gravity had a side hobby. Something was calling, not loudly, not with trumpets or glowing portals, just a curiosity. So he got up, not dressed, just in his boxers and socks with little pizzas on them. He didn't need armor for this, just quiet. He followed the pull down the hallway, past Meg's door, where aggressive typing and a podcast about mushroom capitalism echoed, past Peter's room, where he was snoring and muttering, "Yes, Mr. T, I'd love another meatball," past Stewie's lair, locked tight, of course, and finally to the attic. Chris had only been in the attic 3 times before, once to hide from a squirrel that had followed him home, once to find the Christmas ornaments that Peter had used to build a Santa defense drone, and once when he got lost during hide-and-seek and ended up napping inside a box labeled eggs. Real? Tonight, the attic felt different. The moonlight bled through the cracked window, bathing everything in soft silver. Dust floated like snow in slow motion. And in the far corner, half hidden under a tarp, was something new. Chris pulled the tarp. A mirror. But not just any mirror. This one wasn't from IKEA or Lois's antique phase. This one looked like it had been pulled from the wreckage of a haunted cruise ship. The frame was carved with symbols, some familiar, some definitely made up. A catfish chasing its own tail. A spoon with wings, a sandwich split perfectly down the middle. And the glass shimmered. Not like a normal reflection. No, this shimmered like water remembers being ocean, like the surface wanted to pull you through. Chris looked at it, and the mirror looked back. But the boy inside it wasn't just Chris. His hair was windswept like he'd been on a mountaintop. His eyes were sharp, glowing faintly. He wore a cloak made of glittering feathers and held a pencil like it was a wand. Mirror Chris smiled, then raised a hand. Chris raised his own. The mirror rippled. Then the attic creaked. Not from the house shifting, but from something else. The mirror trembled, and Chris heard a voice. Not out loud, not in English, It was like a memory had been inserted into his brain. You've been watching the dream too long, Chris. It's time to step into it. And then the mirror blinked. No, not blinked. It closed. The shimmering stopped. His reflection returned to normal. Socks, pizza print, confused face. Just Chris. He touched the glass. Cold. Ordinary. But something had changed. He wasn't sure what. The next day, Chris didn't talk much at breakfast. Peter was trying to balance eggs on his belly. Stewie was feeding Brian something labeled cognitive softener. Meg was ranting about how her new TikTok got banned for being too real. Lois poured juice, looked at Chris, and asked, "Everything okay, honey?" He nodded, but there was a look in his eyes. The kind you get when you realize the background noise has a melody. At school, he saw Lily again. She had drawn a city made entirely of birds. Some were perched like buildings. Others flew in spirals that looked like elevators. Chris showed her a new sketch. It was him standing in front of a mirror, but the reflection had wings. She smiled. "I think you're ready," she whispered. He blinked. "Ready for what?" "To remember what you forgot to imagine." Chris sat alone at lunch, not because he had to. Neil Goldman had offered to trade a fruit cup for conversation, and even Connie D'Amico had half-jokingly called him a silent weirdo with potential. But Chris declined. Not rudely, just distractedly. He was sketching again. Not just doodling this time, sketching like it meant something. The pencil moved as if his hand knew something his brain hadn't been told yet. There were shapes, spirals and eyes, so many eyes woven into towers and wings and lakes that whispered. He didn't even notice Principal Shepard walking past until the man said, "Looks like detention in Doodle Town." Chris blinked. "Sorry?" But Shepard had already moved on, muttering something about how art leads to jazz and jazz leads to regret. Chris stared at the drawing again. There were words hidden in it now. He hadn't written them. They just were. He who forgets becomes the feeder. That night, Chris didn't go home. Not right away. Instead, he wandered. Through Quahog, past the news station, where Tom Tucker was practicing wink synchronization with a mirror, past the Clam, where Cleveland was trapped in an intense discussion with Quagmire about whether or not feet are a form of currency, past the used DVD store where someone had organized all the rom-coms by how many dogs appear in the third act. Well, everything was normal, ridiculous, familiar, and somehow still distant. He finally stopped at the Spooner Street playground. The one with the two swings one always broken, and the weird merry-go-round that turned even when nobody was on it. He sat on a bench. The moon above him was too big, not metaphorically, physically too big, like someone had dragged it closer for dramatic effect. That's when Lily appeared again. Not walking, just there. Like the moon had pulled her in. "You're not dreaming," she said. "But you're also not completely awake anymore." Chris blinked. "I feel like I'm in between chapters of a book I never started." "That's exactly where you are," Lily replied and sat beside him. "And the book is upside down." They didn't laugh, but they didn't need to. The air between them softened, like the pages of that imaginary book had turned on their own. Chris asked, "Is this one of those stories where I find out I'm secretly powerful?" Lily shook her head gently. "No, you've always been powerful. You just stopped noticing." He frowned. "Everyone sees me as dumb." "Because it's easier than listening," she said. That sentence hit him like a cartoon piano, softly, devastating. Chris looked up at the giant moon. "Why me?" Because you're the quietest part of the loudest family in the loudest town in the weirdest timeline, Lily answered, like it was obvious. Which means you're the only one still tuned to the static. And that static? She leaned closer. It's not noise. It's the original melody. He felt a chill. Not fear. More like recognition. Back at home, the Griffins were embroiled in their nightly chaos. Peter had decided he was now a part-time horse lawyer. He'd built a courtroom in the living room using cereal boxes and insisted on speaking in nays with Brian translating. Lois was threatening to burn all of Stewie's puppet children if he didn't return her bath bombs. Meg had barricaded her room and declared it an independent nation with its own time zone and flag a single sock on a fork. Chris walked past all of it, unbothered, like none of it could reach him now. He climbed the stairs. The attic was calling again. Not pulling this time, inviting. And this time, when he reached the mirror, it was already awake. No tarp, no dust, just light. He stared into it. The reflection this time wasn't a version of himself. It was all versions of himself, layered like a photo filter slideshow. One was a knight, another a painter, another a cosmic librarian with keys dangling from his fingers. They all looked at him. They all smiled. The glass melted away, and Chris stepped through. Not with a sound, not with a flash. Just a soft ripple, like stepping into a dream made of memory. The world on the other side was strange. It looked like Quahog, but it wasn't. Everything shimmered like stained glass and chalk drawings. Buildings blinked. Trees whispered names. The ground beneath him pulsed faintly like the heartbeat of a forgotten god. He was still in his normal clothes. But he was holding something now. A paintbrush. Not a weapon, not a tool. But it felt powerful. Behind him, Lily appeared once more. This time wearing a cape made of notebook paper and stars. "This is the canvas," she said. "It was left behind when your family's noise got too loud." Chris turned slowly. "I can change it?" "You already are." Suddenly there was a tremor in the air. From the horizon, something moved. Not fast, but steady, like a train made of static and doubt. It curled through the sky, dragging behind it pieces of forgotten thoughts and misplaced potential. Lily said only 2 words. "The feeder." Chris tightened his grip on the brush. He didn't know what to do. But he knew this, he wouldn't be afraid. Not this time. The feeder slithered through the dream quilt sky, its body stitched from static and chewed-up VHS tape. It didn't roar. It hummed the same low, numbing tone as a television, left on at 3 a.m. when no one's watching. And with every pulse of that hum, Chris felt old memories tug at his clothes like needy ghosts. He saw flashes. Him at age 5, building a blanket fort only to be told it was in the way of the new home gym Lois would never use. Him at age 9, winning school's most improved ribbon, the only award he ever got, and having Peter tape it to the bottom of Stewie's diaper as a joke. Him, just last year, writing a poem so beautiful his English teacher cried, but no one believed he'd written it. And now this thing, this static beast, floating across the sky, consuming forgotten efforts, overlooked moments, and that quiet space where people like Chris lived. Lily didn't speak. She didn't need to. Chris stepped forward. He lifted the brush. The ground shimmered beneath his feet. A trail of light spread from each step, as if the earth itself was waking up beneath him. The trees leaned in. The houses blinked in rhythm. The stars started humming a tune only he could hear. And then, with one calm, deliberate motion, Chris dipped the brush into the air and painted a door. A real one. Made of color, light, and old wooden creaks. He opened it and stepped through. Now he was in Peter's mind. But not present-day Peter. This was a younger version, teenaged, still full of dreams and stupidity in equal measure. The inside of Peter's mind looked like a Chuck E. Cheese crossed with a demolition derby, foam cheese on fire, animatronic bears on tricycles, a jukebox playing Kiss from a Rose on loop. Peter was there, wearing a tuxedo t-shirt and drinking a root beer float from a football helmet. "Chris," he said, blinking like a confused raccoon, "what are you doing in my nostalgia pit?" Chris didn't answer. He just observed. Peter's memories were a chaotic blur, a parade of nonsense. Him stealing Lois's engagement ring and replacing it with a gummy worm. Him setting a treehouse on fire and blaming gravity. Him naming Chris after a failed hamburger mascot. But in the corner, hidden behind arcade cabinets and a poster of Kool-Aid Man doing taxes, there was something different, a flicker of warmth, a real memory. Young Peter holding baby Chris for the first time. Peter looked terrified. Awkward, but smiling. He said something that echoed through the false walls of his mind. "I don't know how to be a dad, but I promise I'll try." Then the feeder's hum returned, curling through even this place. Chris turned away. That was enough. He dipped his brush again, painted another door. This time he stepped into Meg's thoughts. It was mostly screaming. Just a wall of high-pitched, endless screaming. And a pile of angry Tumblr blogs stacked like Jenga. Still, there were fragments. Meg hiding under her bed, whispering encouragement to herself. Meg drawing elaborate fantasy kingdoms where she was queen, hero, and audience all in one. Meg, alone at prom, but dancing anyway. Chris quietly painted a light around those fragments. Not to change them, just to keep them from being swallowed. And then, the feeder's shadow ripped into this memory, too. It wasn't attacking. It wasn't even angry. It was hungry. For the unnoticed. For the discarded. For the forgotten love buried under the noise. Chris turned away again. He couldn't stay in one place too long. Each visit left a crack in the memory. He painted again. Now, Brian. This one was weird. Brian's mind was an espresso bar and a jazz club in the middle of a courtroom. There were at least 4 versions of Brian in there, one giving legal advice, one reciting poetry, one smoking a cigarette and judging the other 2, and one just barking at a mirror. Chris didn't even stay long. He didn't need to. He saw enough. Brian's crippling need to be taken seriously. His fear of being average. His self-loathing tucked inside all that faux sophistication. Chris left a single painted paw print behind, like a quiet thank you. Then he dipped his brush one more time. This time he went somewhere deeper, not into someone's mind, into a room. It was old, dusty, familiar. The attic, but not the real one, the original one, the memory of it. Before the boxes, before the mirror. Back when it was just a forgotten space where childhood dreams used to float. In the center stood Lily. Only now she was taller. Wearing armor made of family photos, newspaper clippings, and tiny torn pages from Chris's old sketchbooks. She held her own brush now. But hers was burning. Not destructively, more like a sparkler at the edge of a new year. "The feeder is nearly full," she said. Chris looked up. The sky above the room split. The feeder descended. It didn't roar. It sighed the exhausted exhale of a world that had ignored too much for too long. Chris and Lily stood side by side, their brushes lifted, and they painted. Not a wall. Not a shield, but a memory, a pure one. Chris's 7th birthday. The cake was lopsided. The frosting was mostly fingered off by Peter before it reached the table. But for one moment, everyone was laughing with him. Not at him, not around him, with him. That memory painted itself into the air like a mural in slow motion. The feeder paused. Its hum faltered. The sky rippled. And something in the beast's many eyes blinked, not in rage, but recognition. It remembered. For a moment, even the feeder longed for the forgotten sweetness. Then Chris whispered, "You don't need to feed anymore. You're full." The feeder shuddered and vanished. No explosion, no scream. Just gone. Like a nightmare finally forgiven. The attic faded slowly and like the end of a dream that knew it was no longer needed. The warmth of the painted memory lingered in the air, like candle smoke or the last notes of a lullaby. Chris stood there in the stillness, his brush now dim but intact, held in fingers that had begun to understand their own worth. Lily gave him a nod. She didn't vanish. She didn't turn into a puff of symbolism or reveal herself to be a hallucination. She just walked away, toward the far edge of the memory, toward a soft glow where other dreams waited, unpainted but not forgotten. Chris turned back toward the attic ladder, and as he did, something peculiar happened. He woke up. For real this time. Back in his bed. Sunlight bleeding lazily through the blinds, his sketch pad on the nightstand. Brian snoring at the foot of his bed, paw twitching like he'd been chasing regrets in his sleep. Chris sat up. The house was normal again. No beasts, no dreamscapes, just reality with all its TV static, lukewarm cereal, and Meg yelling about something he had definitely forgotten to do. But inside him, something felt different. Not fixed, not transformed, and just aware. Like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as invisible as he thought. He grabbed his sketch pad, flipped it past the page of stick figures with laser arms, past the robot chicken he drew eating the moon, past the crude sketch of Stewie dressed as Britney Spears. There it was, the dream attic. He'd drawn it half asleep, and in the center, a tiny figure holding a glowing brush, smiling. Just then, Peter burst into the room wearing nothing but a Viking helmet and a towel that said, "Kiss the Chef." He held a garden hose and a box of live raccoons. "Chris," he shouted, "we're going to build a trampoline on the roof and launch raccoons into the neighbor's hot tub. You in?" Chris blinked, then smiled. "Yeah, Dad," he said. "I'm in." Because sometimes meaning doesn't come from deep thoughts or dream dragons or revelations. Sometimes it comes from doing something totally, stupidly, joyously Griffin. He grabbed his sketch pad and ran out after Peter, not noticing the last page fluttering free from the book. It drifted gently to the floor. One word scrawled in bold, uneven pencil. Remember. It was a strange kind of morning. Not the kind shaped by alarms or cartoons or the smell of bacon. It was the kind where the sunlight felt oddly warm on your back, and the hallway seemed a bit too long, like a dream hadn't entirely let go of your brain just yet. Chris followed the sound of Peter's shouting through the house, past the kitchen, where Lois was furiously scrubbing something red and suspicious from the ceiling while muttering, "No more chili experiments! No more chili experiments!" Past Meg, who was trying to staple her jeans together for some reason. Past Stewie, who was building what appeared to be a pocket-sized guillotine for grapes. And finally, up to the roof. Peter stood triumphantly at the edge, wielding a garden hose like a lasso. Beside him was a rickety old trampoline, at least 3 feet wide and probably older than Chris. The raccoons were in a box marked "Live, Laughs, Love," which Peter had clearly misunderstood from the home decor section. All right, buddy, Peter grinned. You ready to launch some garbage pandas into suburban history? Chris hesitated for half a second, then nodded. Let's do it. And for the next 10 minutes, the neighborhood bore witness to something that could only be described as raccoon-based performance art. Peter cackled like a man possessed, slipping on wet shingles, yelling, "Ricoche!" as one raccoon somersaulted off the trampoline and into the neighbor's flamingo lawn sculpture. Chris, he laughed too, genuinely, loudly. Not because he didn't feel strange anymore, but because maybe it was okay to feel strange and still laugh. Eventually, Lois stormed out, screamed, "Are you kidding me?" in 5 different octaves, and shut the whole operation down with the precision of a woman who once killed a bear with a spatula. That's never been confirmed, but Brian swears he saw it. Peter wandered back inside, defeated, muttering about building a raccoon cannon instead. Chris stayed on the roof for a moment longer. From here, everything looked smaller. The mailbox that always leaned a little to the left. The treehouse they never really used. The sidewalk where Meg once tried to sell emotionally haunted lemonade. Chris sat, the sketch pad open on his knees. He didn't draw, not yet. Instead, he thought. It wasn't like the attic dream. That had been swirling, strange, beautiful. This was the opposite. Sharp edges, real air, the sound of Cleveland yelling about the raccoons stuck in his mailbox. But he felt something pulling through both worlds now, a thread. Maybe what he felt wasn't invisibility. Maybe it was a sort of translucency, like he was there, but most people just didn't know how to look. He sketched the yard below. Quick lines, honest lines. He added a tiny Peter waving, Meg tripping over a hose, Stewie plotting from the shadows, and he added himself sitting on the roof drawing it all. In that moment, Chris wasn't just a Griffin kid. He wasn't the awkward one, or the dumb one, or the punchline and the greasy gag. He was the observer, the quiet archivist of absurdity. And he smiled. Then the sketch pad was snatched from his hands. "What? Hey!" he shouted. It was Neil Goldman, standing on the roof somehow, holding Chris's sketchbook like it was a Comic-Con prop. "Bro," Neil wheezed. "Did you draw this? Is this us? Holy crap, you drew me with abs. I look like Hebrew Spider-Man." Chris blinked. "Neil, how did you get up here?" Neil pointed vaguely downward. "Used a stack of old Playboys as a stepladder. Thanks to your dad. And your mom. And, wow, your whole family's got weird issues." Chris reached for the pad, but Neil dodged. No, wait. This is good, man. This is like real good. You're like talented. Not just like didn't eat the glue talented." Chris felt his face flush. Compliments didn't usually come at him that fast, or at all. "You should publish this," Neil said. "Seriously? Like an underground zine, or a webcomic, or wait, better idea. A VR sim where you become you and just like wander your own dysfunctional life. It'll be the next Rick and Morty, but sadder and with more mustard stains." Chris laughed, then hesitated. "You think people would actually read something like this?" Neil looked at him, sincere for once. "Dude, people eat up trauma and weird family stuff like it's free breadsticks. And yours is like an endless Olive Garden." Chris didn't know what to say. For the first time in a while, someone wasn't just tolerating him. They were interested, maybe even impressed. The idea stuck in his brain like peanut butter on toast. Not a fantasy, not a dream attic, just a simple truth. Maybe he did have something worth sharing. Later that night, Chris sat at the family computer, the one Peter mostly used for fantasy football and Meg used to scream into Reddit. He hesitated, then opened a new tab, searched how to publish webcomic, got lost, Accidentally clicked the link that led to Quagmire's OnlyFans. Panicked. Reset the browser. Then tried again. He scanned over websites, platforms, and forums. All the while, Stewie peeked around the corner silently, sipping juice and muttering, "Oh dear. The oaf is learning digital autonomy. What fresh horror will this bring?" And just like that, Chris uploaded his first panel. No title. No tagline. Just a drawing. The Griffin house, mid-chaos. Lois tossing a flaming meatloaf out the window. Peter watching YouTube tutorials on how to turn a microwave into a jet ski. Meg crying because her phone screen cracked inward. Brian passed out with a wine glass. Stewie holding a detonator. And Chris? Chris was in the corner. Drawing it all. Chris stared at the screen. The image flickered for a moment, as if the internet itself had to pause and squint before accepting that he had posted something. No likes, no comments. Just the silence of cyberspace, infinite and yawning. He leaned back in the chair, letting out a long breath. Well, okay then. Behind him, the sound of a mop slapping wet tile echoed from the kitchen, followed by Lois shouting, "Why is there marinara in the light switch?" Somewhere upstairs, Peter yelled, "Don't come in. I'm building trust with the raccoons again." Chris smiled. Not because everything was okay. It wasn't. It never was. But for the first time, he didn't feel like he had to escape it, not through dreams or attic adventures or even drawings. Maybe he didn't need the world to change. Maybe he just needed to see it clearly and sketch it exactly the way it was. He hit refresh. One like. Username. Melancholy Muffin, 69. "Who the heck?" Chris murmured. He clicked the profile. It was private. Profile picture was a muffin with a knife stabbed into it. Classic internet. Weird. Supportive. Possibly dangerous. But it meant someone saw it. He stared at the screen a while longer, then stood up and stretched. His spine popped like a bag of chips. It was late, and the house was settling into that barely coherent lull between chaos and dreams, lights dimming, TV murmuring, the faint hiss of Meg listening to motivational speeches through the wall because she was trying to manifest boyfriend energy. Chris wandered back to his room. The attic was locked again, as if it knew its purpose had been served, as if it understood that dreams were meant to wake you up, not trap you forever. Down the hall, Stewie was humming a lullaby in Latin while brushing his teddy bear's hair with a stolen toothbrush. Brian lay passed out on the floor, a copy of Infinite Jest resting on his chest, open to the same unread page it had been on for months. Chris tiptoed past, back into his own space. His room was still the same. Messy. Weird. A place where time felt oddly suspended between teenage years and perpetual second childhood. He lay on his bed, arms crossed behind his head, staring at the ceiling. A faint sound buzzed from his laptop. Another notification. 2 more likes. Then a comment. "This is weirdly real. Post more." It was anonymous, but Chris felt it, that tiny electric spark of validation. Of being noticed, not in a scream, not in a gag, not in a punchline, but in a way that whispered, "You matter." And it wasn't coming from the dream addict, or his parents, or his weird, weaponized baby brother. It was coming from strangers, real ones, somewhere out there. He thought about that for a long time, and he decided tomorrow he'd draw more. Not just the jokes, not just the Griffin madness, but the quiet moments, the in-between. The way Meg looked hopeful when she thought nobody noticed. The way Peter's face fell for a split second when he got something wrong and realized it. The way Lois sometimes stood alone at the sink at night, not moving, not blinking, just being. The moments that nobody ever paused to hold. Chris would draw all of it. He reached for his sketch pad, scribbled down an idea for the next comic. It featured a half-destroyed living room, Stewie lecturing raccoons about moral relativism, and Peter wearing nothing but a cowboy hat and rollerblades yelling, "Saddle up, Lois!" But in the corner, he drew himself again. This time standing taller. Still awkward. Still Chris. But seen. Finally, seen. And as sleep crept in, soft and steady, he didn't dream of attics. He dreamt of blank pages, and the strange, sacred power of filling them with truth. Chris awoke to the sound of Peter hammering something. Not the sound of hammering something like a wall or a nail, just hammering. No target, no project. Just Peter in the backyard, slamming a hammer into the air and screaming, "I'm making changes, Lois." Chris rolled over and groaned into his pillow. He had slept dreamlessly, which was nice, peaceful even. But now reality was pouring back in like hot coffee on a white rug. He shuffled to the window. Outside, Peter had built what could only be described as a trampoline catapult hybrid. It was pointed directly at Mort's pharmacy. "Dad, what are you doing?" Chris called out through the open window. Peter looked up wearing his usual white shirt, green pants, and, oddly, a sash that read vengeance. "Son," he bellowed proudly, "we're waging suburban warfare against price gouging." Lois stepped out the back door with a face like a headache, made flesh. "Peter, I swear to God, if you fling another goat through Mort's roof." "Wasn't a goat, Lois. That was a freedom sheep. It identifies as an insurance deductible." Chris sighed and let the curtain fall back into place. So much for calm reflection. The Griffin house was still its usual blend of chaos, delusion, and obscure declarations of war. But maybe that was okay. He got dressed. Slightly wrinkled shirt, one sock inside out, jeans with permanent ketchup stains, and headed downstairs. The kitchen smelled like someone had tried to microwave seafood and forgot to take it out. Twice. Meg was at the table watching a video called "How to Achieve Inner Peace Using Only Screaming." She looked up briefly and said, "You're going to want to avoid the living room." "Too late?" Chris poked his head in and immediately regretted it. Peter had apparently invited Quagmire, Joe, and Cleveland over for what he was calling suburban tactical training, which involved Nerf guns, pizza boxes as armor, and the declaration that the garage was now a sovereign nation. Quagmire was crouched behind a couch cushion fort, yelling, "I swear to God, Joe, if you launch another water balloon into my quiche, I'm going to flip." Joe, rolling by on a motorized cooler, shouted, "It was strategic hydration, Glenn." Chris backed away slowly. "Can I just eat cereal without getting conscripted?" he muttered. Lois emerged from the hallway, her arms full of laundry, her face on the edge of a nervous breakdown. "Christopher, honey, please don't engage with them today. I've already had to file one insurance claim and write an apology letter to the state of Rhode Island." Chris nodded and slipped into the kitchen, poured himself a bowl of sugar sludge O's, and sat down across from Meg. She was still staring at her phone, muttering, "Screaming is the new meditation." Chris reached into his backpack and pulled out his sketch pad. The comic he posted last night had 3 more likes now. Still small, still anonymous, but he felt steady, grounded. He flipped to a fresh page and started sketching the scene in the living room. Joe on a cooler, Peter in his vengeance sash, Quagmire ducking behind a child's beanbag chair. He drew it all. Chaos, detail, absurdity. Then, without thinking, he added a caption. "When your therapy budget is friendship." He laughed softly. Meg glanced over. "What's that?" "Just something I'm working on." She peered closer. "Huh? That's actually not bad. It wasn't glowing praise, but from Meg it might as well have been a Pulitzer. Later that afternoon, Peter burst into Chris's room carrying a megaphone, 2 tennis rackets duct-taped together, and a jar labeled Strategic Pickles. "Chris, we need you. Cleveland defected to the garage and took the remote. We're launching a full-scale operation, codenamed Tupperware Thunder." Chris blinked. "Dad, I'm kind of drawing something right now." Peter stopped, looked at him, actually paused for a second. "Oh," Peter said. "Is it, like, important?" Chris hesitated. He could say no. He could join the madness, launch Pickles, be the hero of a completely unnecessary living room war. But he looked down at the sketch pad and nodded. "Yeah, it kind of is." Peter gave a slow, confused nod. Okay. That's cool. Just let me know if you want to join later. We got Capri's sons and a legal loophole that technically makes the vacuum cleaner a war crime." And with that, he left. Chris smiled again and returned to his drawing. That evening, things calmed, relatively speaking. Stewie had launched a weather balloon filled with glitter over Quahog and was currently writing a cease and desist letter to Elon Musk for stealing his vibe. Brian was reading Proust and sipping boxed wine while muttering something about postmodern ennui. But Chris was uploading a new strip. This one was of Peter building a rocket out of lawn chairs and fireworks. The caption read, "When your father thinks OSHA is just a guy who can't handle adventure." He hit post. Within a minute, 5 likes. 1 comment. "Is this what having a dad is like? I think I'm scared." He chuckled and leaned back. Outside, the stars blinked into existence. Somewhere in the yard, Peter screamed, "I'm a sky man now." Chris didn't even flinch. Because this was normal. This was his life, and for once, he didn't feel like he had to change it to matter. He just had to draw it. The calm didn't last long. It never did in the Griffin household. Just as Chris leaned back into the soft hum of validation, a loud crash echoed from the garage, followed by Stewie's furious voice. "Brian, how many times must I tell you, no Labrador saliva in the test tubes?" Chris barely flinched. He'd become fluent in ambient catastrophe. His brain registered those sounds the same way normal kids registered cicadas or sprinklers, background noise. He went back to doodling. This time, he started sketching Stewie mid-rage, a baby-sized tyrant wielding a tiny lab coat and a flamethrower made of toy parts and resentment. In the corner, Brian slouched with a juice box, looking like a failed poet from Brooklyn. He added a caption, "Science is 10% inspiration, 90% domestic terrorism." He grinned. Chris may not have had friends at school, may not have had status or charm or a grasp on what TikTok was anymore. But he had this. He had a front row seat to the weirdest sitcom reality never filmed. And tonight, it was all just pouring out of him. Back downstairs, the war games had transitioned from full-scale Nerf warfare to a Monopoly-based standoff where Cleveland had annexed Boardwalk, Quagmire was caught laundering railroad properties, and Joe was threatening to impound everyone's thimbles. Peter, naturally, declared himself dictator and rebranded the game Peteropoly, where the only rule was that he won. Chris peeked in, took one look at the board, and just turned away without a word. In the living room, Meg was now watching a YouTube video titled Top 10 Reasons You Might Be the Unchosen One. It had 14 million views. "Number 6 is just a mirror," she muttered bitterly. "They literally hold up a mirror." Chris plopped down beside her. You ever wonder if we're the only two people in this house with brain cells? Meg side-eyed him. Oh, now you're ready to bond? He shrugged. I draw cartoons of our family. If that's not trauma processing, I don't know what is. She snorted. Fair. The TV was playing a low-budget crime drama from the 90s. A detective in shoulder pads stared grimly into the camera, while jazz saxophone wailed behind her. Meg muted it. They sat in silence for a bit. Chris broke it. Did you ever want to be, famous? Meg gave a short laugh. I used to. Now I think I'd settle for functionally ignored. Chris nodded. I kind of thought I'd be more by now. She looked at him, eyebrows raised. You're 16. He blinked. Wait, really? She sighed. Yes, Chris. Oh, huh. Thought I was 25. Meg looked at him like she wasn't entirely convinced he was wrong. Just then, Peter barged in, holding a spatula covered in Monopoly money, with one shoe missing and one eye twitching. Lois, he shouted. Lois, tell Joe he can't arrest me. It's not real jail if the jail is just the laundry room. Lois's voice rang from upstairs, muffled by maternal exhaustion. Peter, if you yell one more time, I'm going to legally marry a cactus and move to Arizona. Peter turned to Chris and Meg. Kids, if your mother divorces me for a plant, you'll still visit, right? Especially you, Chris. You're my third favorite. Meg raised an eyebrow. Who's number one? Stewie, Peter said immediately. Because he's basically an evil genius, and I'm afraid of him. And number two? Depends if Brian's drunk or not. He disappeared back into the hallway. Chris turned back to Meg. Third favorite isn't bad. Bronze medal in Griffin parenting. Yeah, but there's only 5 of us. Still the top 60%. Later that night, Chris was back upstairs, headphones on, watching his comic notifications trickle in. Someone had commented, "This feels too real to be fake." Another said, "Are you spying on my dad?" He had 27 likes now. Not huge, but something. Enough to feel like he was slowly building whatever it was he was meant to be. He started drawing again. This time, it wasn't even about a joke. He sketched the family at dinner, the mess, the noise, the absurdity. Lois yelling about spoons, Stewie reading an advanced robotics manual while chewing on a crayon, Peter telling an incredibly inaccurate story about how he invented chocolate milk. He added soft lines, shading little details. Meg staring into the void, Brian reading something pretentious. Himself just watching it all from the corner of the table. The caption came last. Home isn't where the heart is. It's where you're least surprised when the cat's wearing sunglasses and yelling in German. He saved the file, but didn't post it. Some things were just for him. Downstairs, Peter was trying to install a hot tub in the living room using only a garden hose and a metal salad bowl. He shouted up the stairs, "Chris, come help your old man feel something again." Chris opened his door and leaned over the banister. "Does it involve near death?" Peter nodded proudly. "Almost exclusively." Chris grinned. "Give me 5 minutes." He turned back to his sketch pad, tapped the cover gently, and slid it under his bed. Then he grabbed a towel. Because if you're going to survive life in the Griffin household, sometimes you just have to go full tilt into the madness, not in spite of who you are, but because of it. And maybe, just maybe, this was his way of belonging. Even if nobody saw it just yet. Chris stepped into the living room and was immediately greeted with the faint but distinct smell of burnt rubber and lemon-scented floor cleaner. The hot tub, if one could call it that, looked more like a medieval torture device repurposed by someone who had only skimmed the Wikipedia page for plumbing. Peter stood beside it, shirtless and wearing aviator goggles, holding a leaf blower pointed directly at a salad bowl slowly filling with lukewarm hose water. A beach ball floated next to a bag of Cheetos. "Behold!" Peter shouted triumphantly, his voice echoing slightly from the metal bowl. "The jacuzzi of destiny." Chris blinked. "Why is it humming?" Peter leaned in conspiratorially. "That's either the power of dream, or I dropped my electric razor in there, and now it's vibrating with male energy." Chris took a cautious step closer. "Are we going in it?" Peter nodded. "Only if you're ready to become a man." Chris furrowed his brow. "Didn't you once say that happened when I beat that rotisserie chicken in an arm wrestling match?" Peter looked wistful. "Yeah, that was a beautiful day." Lois entered the room with the cold, dead eyes of someone who had fought one too many battles for her sanity. "I swear to God," Stewie muttered, "one of you will eventually be responsible for my villain origin story, and when that happens, mark my words, I will not show mercy." Chris laughed. Not out of malice, but because this was normal. This was their version of peace. If the Griffin household had a coat of arms, it would be a flying pizza slice over a flaming lawn chair with the words, "We tried," in Comic Sans. "Hey, Dad," Chris asked, still sitting in the bowl, "do you think I'll ever be good at anything?" Peter paused mid-blow with the leaf blower and looked down at his son for a rare moment of lucidity flickering across his face. "Chris, you built a battle robot out of a lawnmower once. You accidentally turned Meg's curling iron into a flamethrower. You've eaten crayons and survived. I think you're already good at being you, which is a lot more than most people ever manage." Chris stared at him. "That was actually kind of deep." Peter scratched his belly. "Yeah, I had a big poop earlier. It clears the mind." There it was. The moment shattered just as it always did. But Chris didn't mind. Later that evening, while the jacuzzi of destiny was being quietly dismantled by Joe, who showed up uninvited with building code violations in hand, Chris slipped upstairs again to work on his comic. Tonight's entry was bold. A full splash page of the living room scene with Peter in his goggles, Chris mid-fall from the bowl, and Stewie in the background about to detonate something questionable. The caption read, "Just another Tuesday." The comments rolled in quickly now. Someone had written, "This feels like my family, but dialed up to 11. Another wrote, "I don't know what universe this is from, but I want to move there." He smiled. Chris didn't know if he wanted to be known, but he did want to be understood. Maybe this comic was the bridge, the portal through which he could say everything without ever needing to speak. A few minutes later, his phone buzzed. A DM from someone named Sketchlad420. "Hey man, your comic is weirdly real. Is it based on anyone?" Chris stared at the message for a while, then replied, "Yeah, it's based on my family, but also kinda everyone's family." The next message came instantly. "That makes it even funnier." He turned off his phone and leaned back. The soft glow of the desk lamp bathed his sketches in warm light. The house was surprisingly quiet for once. Which meant, boom! The explosion rattled the window panes. A split second later, Stewie's voice rang out, panicked and furious. "Brian, I told you to label the explosives. You can't just put spicy snacks on a box of thermite." Chris chuckled to himself and scribbled something in the corner of the page. "Chaos is a comfort food." Chris stared at the phrase for a moment, then underlined it with a lazy swipe of his pencil. The graphite smudged slightly under his thumb, a happy accident that gave the words a shadow. Like even his stray fingerprints wanted to leave a mark on his art. Downstairs, the chaos had started its usual descent into ambient Griffin noise. Stewie's angry muttering blended with the sound of Brian calmly denying all responsibility. Peter laughed maniacally into the distance, likely at a joke only he understood, and Meg slammed her door after yelling something about respect and not being invisible. Chris closed his sketchbook, setting it gently beside his growing stack of spiral-bound volumes. The pile was getting taller, a quiet little tower of his thoughts, jokes, ideas, and midnight emotions. If anyone ever read them, they'd probably laugh or worry. But for Chris, they were sacred. A breadcrumb trail leading somewhere only he knew how to follow. He walked over to the window and looked out across Spooner Street. The sun had dipped far enough to paint everything with that soft orange filter, like the world was dipped in warm soup. Across the street, Joe was trying to reason with Peter, who now wore a snorkel, and was arguing that the driveway counted as international waters. Chris rested his chin on the window pane and let his eyes blur slightly, letting everything melt into a smudge of color and muffled shouting. This was his world, a mad little snow globe of dysfunction and bad ideas. But buried beneath it all, beneath the gags and pratfalls and chicken fights, there was love. A weird, greasy, explosive, utterly bizarre kind of love, but love nonetheless. Suddenly the house vibrated again, this time from the upstairs bathroom. "Damn it!" Lois's voice echoed from above. "Who put a slice of bologna in the shower head?" Chris didn't even blink. "Probably Peter," he mumbled automatically. He wandered back to his desk and pulled open one of the drawers. Inside was a folder labeled Portfolio if college ever happens, and inside that, tucked between doodles of muscle-bound cats and a still incomplete parody of Naruto called Noodle-Ruto, was a sketch Chris had never shown anyone. It was a self-portrait, but not like the kind he drew for class, with awkward shading and weird neck proportions. This one had him sitting at a drawing table, with light radiating out of the pages and surrounding him in a cocoon of cartoon sparkles, pizza slices, comic bubbles, and a floating Peter head shouting, "Roadhouse," in the distance. The caption underneath read, "This is where I feel most real." Chris smiled. Sometimes he didn't feel real, not at school, not at dinner, not even during Christmas when he got to open presents and pretend the socks from Aunt Glenda were exciting. But here, in the flickering lamplight, with the pencil dust on his fingers and his world spread out in pages, he felt present. He wasn't just Peter's weird son, or Meg's weirder brother, or Stewie's occasional sidekick. He was Chris, the artist, the observer, the one who noticed the way people laughed just a second too long when they were nervous, the one who drew the moment when Lois's eye twitched before she exploded in rage. The one who saw Peter hugging the dog when he thought no one was looking. Chris saw it all. And for once, he wasn't trying to be the center of it. He just wanted to draw it. As the evening settled fully into night, and the sky turned from marmalade to ink, Chris lay back on his bed. The ceiling fan spun slowly overhead, making soft, clicking sounds that matched the rhythm of his heartbeat. His sketchbook sat on his chest, open to a fresh page. He hadn't drawn anything yet. Not because he didn't have ideas, but because this moment of stillness was a rarity. A pause between punchlines, a gap in the laugh track, and he liked it. From the hallway, Peter's voice drifted up. "Chris, if you see a fish tank in the shape of Elvis's head, don't touch it. It's full of angry bees." Chris didn't respond. He just grinned and finally picked up his pencil. A few minutes later, he sketched himself standing in front of a tank shaped like Elvis, filled with buzzing bees wearing sunglasses. One of them had a guitar. Another wore a crown. The caption? "Just another Sunday." He chuckled to himself. And as his eyes grew heavy and the noise of the house slowly faded into soft static, Chris Griffin, the quietest Griffin. Let the story carry on in silence. The pencil rested against the paper. The fan turned overhead. And the chaos of life, with all its mess and volume, settled gently outside his door like an affectionate stray cat. The fan above Chris's bed spun slower now, like even it had gotten sleepy. His sketchbook had slipped sideways across his chest, still open to the Elvis B aquarium. His pencil rested between his fingers, hanging by a thread of gravity and grip, and his lips were parted in the soft snore of someone who's at peace with the weirdness of their world. But Chris wasn't quite gone. Not fully. His dreams were already forming, coming together not like plot points, but like a collage made by a raccoon, with access to glitter and emotional baggage. First, he stood on the moon. Not the clean, silent moon NASA promised, but a Family Guyified version where Quagmire owned a surf shop called Space Giggity. Chris was in a spacesuit made entirely of duct tape and sandwich bags, and instead of stars, the sky was filled with VHS tapes of 80s sitcoms spinning slowly like celestial frisbees. Then Peter drifted past him on a pool float shaped like Cleveland's face, waving a giant novelty fork and shouting, "Christopher, the pasta dimension is open. Grab the garlic swans." In any other brain, that would be nonsense. In Chris's, it made total sense. He saluted with a ladle and floated after his dad. Cut 2, a courtroom. Chris now stood trial in front of a panel of animated squirrels in powdered wigs. His crime? Excessive dreaming. Stewie was his lawyer, using a sock puppet to argue constitutional dream rights, and Brian played the stenographer, typing on a keyboard made of ham. The judge squirrel slammed a gavel made of a melted Pez dispenser. "Guilty. You are hereby sentenced to 1 eternity of emotional ambiguity." Chris blinked, and suddenly he was back in his childhood bedroom. Not his current childhood bedroom, but the earlier one, the version that existed during Season 3. Posters of late 90s boy bands still hung askew. A lava lamp bubbled gently next to a baseball trophy he had never quite earned. He walked over to the mirror. In it, he saw every version of himself he'd ever been. Fat baby Chris. Awkward braces era Chris. Cowboy hat-wearing side character Chris. The Chris who got a makeover from Stewie. The Chris who briefly dated that girl from the country club and ate too many club sandwiches out of nervousness. They all stared back at him, blinking in perfect sync. "You ever feel like we're just background noise?" one version whispered. Chris didn't answer. He just nodded. And then he reached forward and high-fived himself. The mirror shattered. Not violently, but like the glass had been waiting for that to happen. Behind it wasn't wall or insulation, but a bright white hallway lined with floating sketchbooks and drifting memories. Chris stepped through without hesitation. This wasn't scary. This was familiar. Pages from his past danced by him in the air, literal pages. One showed the time Peter accidentally launched the family car into a marching band. Another displayed Meg covered in bees after trying a natural moisturizer Stewie invented. And another, surprisingly soft, showed Lois quietly fixing Chris's tie before a school photo. Her eyes were tired, her hair frizzed, but her hands were gentle. Chris reached for that page, holding it lightly. It was warm to the touch, like it had been baked by memory itself. He smiled. Then suddenly, without warning, the hallway began to rumble. A crack split through the floating bookshelves. Out from the fissure came the one figure Chris never expected to see in his subconscious. Herbert. Yes, that Herbert. The elderly neighbor with the world's creepiest whistle and a freezer full of popsicles. But this time, he was wearing a full wizard robe and floating slightly off the ground, surrounded by faint musical notes, from a suspiciously familiar show tune. "Oh no," Chris whispered. "Not again." "Welcome back, Christopher," Herbert sang, twirling a lollipop wand. "The prophecy returns." "Nope." Chris spun on his heel and ran full speed into a giant banana wearing a crown. "You must face the past to draw the future," the banana declared, spitting confetti. Chris groaned. "I really need to stop eating beef jerky after midnight." He ran down a side corridor of dream logic, past a room labeled Missed Opportunities, which was just a loop of him walking past open sketch contest posters, past a younger version of himself trying to talk to Connie D'Amico and getting a nosebleed from the stress, and finally out into an open field of cereal mascots. Yes, giant cereal mascots. Tony the Tiger was coaching a little league team of marshmallow ghost clones. The Trix Rabbit sat on a throne of lies. Snap, Crackle, and Pop were arguing over crypto. Chris sat down in the grass. Everything was insane. Everything was loud. Everything was so very him. And yet, he wasn't anxious, not really, because even when his mind went full blender and mixed sitcom logic with unprocessed childhood weirdness, he always knew one thing. He could draw his way through it. He reached into his dream pocket and pulled out a pencil. It was enormous, cartoonish. A Bugs Bunny-sized pencil. With one stroke, he drew a door into reality, a tall archway with glittery handles and a banner that read, "Back to Chapter 4, you weirdo." He smiled and walked through. And on the other side, his bedroom again. Quiet, safe, real. Well, as real as a room could be when the closet occasionally sneezed and the floor sometimes whispered secrets in Peter's voice. Chris stood in the middle of it all and stretched. The dreams would keep coming. The chaos wouldn't stop. But he knew how to hold a pencil. He knew how to make sense of it, one line at a time. And as he turned back to his sketchbook, the next drawing already forming in his head, he whispered, "Let the weirdness begin." Chris sat on his bed with his sketchbook back in his lap, the weight of it grounding him like a paper anchor in the swirling seas of his imagination. The dream was already starting to fade, as dreams do, like watercolor on wet napkins. But its echo stayed with him, not just in memory, but in mood. His mind still hummed with the faint tune of surreal cereal mascots and philosophical bananas. He looked down at the page he had left half-drawn before sleep claimed him. It was still the Elvis bee tank, complete with tiny sunglasses on every bee. But now, somehow, it made more sense. Or maybe he had just stopped asking for explanations. And instead of finishing it, he turned the page. A clean slate. A brand new blank rectangle of possibility. Chris raised his pencil and began to draw, not frantically, not in a feverish need to escape reality, but calmly, like he knew what he was doing. The line came first, a curved arc, soft and easy. Then shapes began forming under his hand, a face, not too familiar, but not entirely new either. It looked like someone he hadn't met yet. Or maybe someone he hadn't become yet. The sketch was rough, imperfect, and exactly what it needed to be. In the hallway, Peter walked past, wearing a shower cap and a Halloween mask for no reason at all. He paused at the door, looked in, and said, "Hey, buddy, you drawing that one dream where you were a giant meatball and I was your lawyer? That was hilarious." Chris didn't even flinch. "No, Dad. This one's about, me." Peter blinked. "Oh, cool. I once drew a picture of me punching Godzilla, and then I taped it to the fridge and it caught fire." "Thanks, Dad." Peter nodded. "You're welcome, champ," he said, walking off, humming the Cops theme tune and whacking the hallway wall with a foam sword. Back in the room, Chris smiled faintly. Not because what Peter said was useful, but because somehow it was enough. The truth was, Chris didn't need anyone else to get it. Not his dad, not Meg, not even Lois, who had probably forgotten he even had a sketchbook. He was okay in the quiet. He was okay in the background. Because he'd found the one place where the background was the story, the space between the pencil lines. He reached over to his nightstand and grabbed a can of soda. It was lukewarm, slightly flat, and left a mild, stinging sensation on his gums, which he took as a sign it was still good. He sipped slowly and looked back at his drawing. It wasn't just a hobby anymore. It was his echo, his language. And maybe, just maybe, someday someone else would look at it and say, "Oh, that's what Chris Griffin was trying to say this whole time." Downstairs, Lois was yelling at Peter for trying to microwave a bath bomb again. Chris chuckled. He turned the page again. This time, he began sketching the chaos itself. Lois was flaming oven mitts. Peter midair as the microwave exploded, his face frozen in dumb glee. Stewie trying to film it all for experimental cinema. Brian reading the New Yorker and pretending not to notice the carpet was on fire. Meg running in with a fire extinguisher while no one acknowledged her, not even the flames. Chris grinned wider. This was his family. Unfiltered, unhinged, and unknowingly poetic. Sure, he might have been forgotten in the whirlwind of their antics. He might not have had a time machine or a catchphrase or a defining role beyond the weird son. But what he did have was a way to turn all of it, every meltdown, every explosion, every long-forgotten subplot, into something lasting. The clock on his nightstand blinked 3:33 a.m. Outside, a raccoon scurried across the lawn with a slice of pizza bigger than its head. Inside, the house creaked in the language of old wood and heavier footsteps. Chris kept drawing. And as the night deepened into that strange in-between space, too late for television, too early for alarm clocks, he felt a quiet peace wrap around him like an oversized hoodie. He wasn't trying to be the center of attention. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He was just trying. And sometimes that was enough. In the corner of the room, his closet door creaked open slightly. From inside came a faint voice. "Hey, psst, do you ever wonder if we're all just inside a TV show?" Chris didn't even turn. "Go to sleep, closet." "Fair enough," the closet said and shut itself. Outside, the stars twinkled like blinking pixels on a screen someone had paused years ago. Inside, the light of Chris's lamp bathed the room in a yellow hush. And with one final line, one last stroke of graphite, Chris closed the sketchbook and set it gently on his nightstand. Tomorrow, he'd go back to school. Maybe get mocked in the hallway. Maybe get stuck in another Griffin family subplot involving cloned goldfish or a haunted trampoline. But tonight, he had drawn the truth. And it was weird. And it was his.
The sun rose like a sleepy spotlight over Spooner Street, catching the edges of Chris Griffin's window just as he shifted under his cartoon dinosaur comforter. One eye blinked open, then the other. There was no alarm clock, no grand orchestral swell of a new day. Just the faint groan of the house settling and the soft plink of something dripping from the bathroom upstairs. A gentle reminder that Peter had once again attempted DIY plumbing after watching a YouTube video titled, "You Don't Need Tools, Just Confidence." Chris sat up slowly, his hair looking like it had spent the night fighting a ghost. He rubbed his eyes and looked toward his sketchbook, still resting exactly where he had left it. For a second, he considered opening it, but the sounds of the house were already beginning to build. Plates clinking, footsteps stomping, and someone yelling, "I'm not wearing that," which was likely Meg arguing with herself in the mirror again. Downstairs, Lois was already orchestrating her morning symphony of chaos. Eggs sizzled in the pan, toast popped with lethal enthusiasm from the toaster, and Peter was sitting at the kitchen table eating cereal out of a Frisbee, because, according to him, bowls are elitist. Chris trudged down the stairs and entered the kitchen with the grace of a sad rhino. "Morning, sweetheart," Lois said without looking. "Grab a plate. Breakfast is almost—" "Peter, stop scooping syrup with your hands." Peter looked up, syrup dripping from his fists like some kind of breakfast-themed monster. "It's called finger food, Lois. Don't be culturally insensitive." Chris quietly grabbed a slice of toast and sat down. Lois eventually turned to him. "Did you sleep all right, honey? You look a little pale." Chris shrugged. "I think I dreamed about being a wizard or a paper bag. I'm not sure anymore." Lois gave him the same look she gave the mailman when he delivered their neighbor's dog by accident. "Uh-huh. Well, just make sure you don't miss the bus. And don't draw anything inappropriate in class today, okay?" Chris blinked. "What do you mean inappropriate?" Lois sighed, walking past him and kissing him quickly on the head. "You drew Mr. Wellington with a duck for a head and labeled him Principal Quack Daddy." "We got a call." Chris smiled. "But that was satire." Lois was already back at the stove. "Well, satire's not allowed during homeroom anymore." Meg stomped down the stairs like she was preparing for war. Her outfit was aggressively normal, which was her version of rebellion now. She looked at Chris with a mix of pity and exhaustion. "Don't forget it's gym today. Coach Riley says if you sit out again, he's going to make you be the volleyball." Chris blinked. "That doesn't sound legal." "It's Spooner Street Public School. Nothing is legal." Peter suddenly stood and declared, "I'm coming to school today." Everyone stopped. Lois turned slowly. "What?" "I'm auditing classes," Peter said, brushing toast crumbs from his belly. "How else am I supposed to keep up with the youth?" "I'm a cool dad, Lois." Lois set down her spatula. "Peter, the last time you went to school, you tried to teach kids how to fake your own death with duct tape and a bag of ham. And the feedback was overwhelmingly positive," he said with a grin. Meg shoved her books into her backpack and muttered, "I'm walking. I refuse to arrive in a car with him again." Chris stood too, wiping his mouth on his sleeve. "Hey," Lois said gently, putting a hand on his shoulder. "Take it easy today, okay? Just try not to get in trouble, and maybe stay away from art class. Give it a break for a day." Chris paused. "But that's my favorite class." "I know, sweetie. Maybe it's time to focus on something more practical." That hit harder than she realized. Chris nodded silently, walked past Peter, who was now loudly debating whether to wear pants, and left the house with a slice of toast in his hand and a new strange ache in his chest. He didn't cry. Not really. But something inside him crinkled, like the edge of a paper that had been folded too many times. At school, things weren't any better. There was something about Chris Griffin that made him a walking punchline. It wasn't that he was doing anything wrong. It was just that he was there. Big, awkward, visibly himself in a school full of people still figuring out who they were supposed to be. In math class, he sat quietly, trying to follow an equation that seemed to be written entirely in ancient bird symbols. In gym, Coach Riley really did consider using him as a volleyball, but settled for making him referee, which somehow resulted in more bruises than playing. At lunch, Chris sat under the stairs, eating alone not out of sadness, but out of routine. It was quieter here. He could think. He pulled a pencil out of his backpack and began sketching on a napkin. At first, it was a turtle with a monocle. Then the turtle had a briefcase. Then the turtle was running for mayor. It was going great until ketchup from his sandwich seeped through the napkin and turned the mayoral turtle into a horrifying red blob of political tragedy. Chris sighed and leaned back against the wall. "Why does everyone else get to be weird on purpose?" he muttered, "and I just get stuck being weird by accident?" Across the cafeteria, a few kids pointed and laughed. Chris didn't look up. He'd gotten good at recognizing that sound without needing to see the faces. And yet, somewhere between the burned toast of breakfast and the ketchup-stained napkin of lunch, something started to shift inside Chris. Not all at once. Not even noticeably. But like the slow thaw of a forgotten ice cube in an old cup, something melted quietly. He stood, tossed the napkin in the trash, and walked out of the cafeteria. Not toward the bathrooms, not toward the library, but toward the art room. Lois had told him to avoid it, which somehow made it feel more like home. The art room was quiet. Too quiet, really. Chris eased the door open slowly, expecting the usual sound of drying paint crackling in trays or brushes clattering in the sink. But the place was still, suspended in the thick scent of clay and glue sticks. The fluorescent lights above buzzed like they were trying to whisper something. Something small and annoying, like, "You forgot to shower." He stepped inside and looked around. Empty chairs, half-finished projects. A papier-mâché bust of Abraham Lincoln with googly eyes. Nothing out of place. Yet everything felt like it was waiting for him. "Back again, Griffin?" Chris turned and saw Miss Canfield, the art teacher, hunched behind her desk with a thermos of what was definitely not just coffee. Her glasses sat crooked on her nose, and her hair looked like it had been styled by a leaf blower. But she had the energy of someone who once went to Burning Man and never fully came back. "I thought you told me to take a break," he said cautiously. "I did, but then I remembered it's art class, not a correctional facility. You want to draw? Draw." Chris blinked. "Really?" Miss Canfield shrugged. "Yeah, just don't sketch another nude portrait of America during Flag Week. Principal Quack Daddy is still recovering." Chris smiled just a little and made his way to the far corner of the room, his usual spot. He pulled out a fresh sheet of paper, the kind with just enough texture to feel important, and started to draw. He didn't know what it would be yet. That was the whole point. The first lines were random, just loops and curves. Then a shape began to emerge. A lumpy figure. A face. His dad? No, not quite. It was a version of Peter. Bigger, rounder, more cartoonish than usual. Like if Peter had been designed by someone who'd only ever heard about him in passing. He gave the figure a grin, then a crown, then a barbecue apron, then flames. Soon the paper was filled with images. A burning grill, a house made of pancakes, Meg as a giant fly buzzing around a courtroom, Lois riding a vacuum like a witch, Stewie in a cape, Brian passed out under a bookshelf labeled unpublished novels. He was drawing his family, but not how they were, how they felt, loud, strange, oversized and underexplained, a chaotic mess of color and half-truths, stitched together with inside jokes and unresolved trauma. Chris kept sketching. He didn't even notice when Miss Canfield walked up behind him and peered over his shoulder. "That's weird," she said. "Yeah," Chris replied softly, "but it's me." That afternoon, back home, things felt just slightly off. Peter was in the backyard, attempting to build a hot tub out of trash cans and lighter fluid. "Lois," he shouted through the screen door, "do we have any extra propane tanks I can huff?" "No, Peter," Lois shouted back, "and if you light anything else on fire today, I swear to God, I will put you in the grill." Chris passed through the chaos like a ghost. He wasn't upset, just distant. He wasn't sure what he'd drawn that afternoon, but it had unlocked something in him, something he couldn't put back in the box. He went up to his room, shut the door, and opened his sketchbook. He flipped past the older pages, the melting cows, the angry raccoon astronauts, the weird Meg vampire hybrids, and landed on a blank one. This time he didn't draw his family. He drew himself. And that was harder. It wasn't about how he looked. It was how he felt again. What did Chris Griffin feel like? He started with the shape of a mountain. Big, round, sturdy. Then he added cracks, vines, cartoon birds flying around its peak. He gave it headphones, a giant heart stitched onto its chest, a cloud raining over one half, a sun baking the other. Then he stopped. He stared at the drawing for a while, then closed the book. Dinner was its usual mess of mismatched conversation and moral ambiguity. "So I said to the cop," Peter began, mouth half full, "if the deer's not pressing charges, I don't see the problem." Lois blinked. "What does that mean, Peter?" "I don't know. It worked." Brian was nursing a martini in a sarcastic comment. Stewie was holding a disassembled toaster and muttering to himself, "Foolish Earth schematics. The coils must bend, not burn. Meg sat across from Chris, texting with the subtlety of a Morse code operator in a thunderstorm. Chris just chewed his meatloaf slowly, looking from one family member to the next. They were insane. He loved them, and they had no idea who he really was. That night, he lay in bed and stared at the ceiling. He didn't want to be famous, or rich, or even particularly understood. He just wanted to matter. Not in a big, world-changing way. Not in a way that required a cape or a catchphrase. He wanted to matter in the way leaves mattered to the wind, or weird dreams mattered in the morning. Quietly, silently, persistently. He glanced at the sketchbook on his nightstand. He didn't reach for it. Not tonight. Tonight, he just let his thoughts drift, floating between comedy and melancholy, like a Family Guy cutaway that starts out funny and ends in existential crisis. And far away in some absurd corner of his subconscious, a chicken rode a jet ski through a flaming ring, and Chris whispered in his sleep, "Don't forget the ketchup." Chris woke up in a sweat, but not the kind of sweat that came from nightmares or spicy meatloaf. It was the kind of sweat that suggested your subconscious had been in an underground boxing match with your self-worth and lost. His sheets were twisted around his legs like soft restraints, and he felt disoriented, like he'd gone through a full season arc in one night. As he sat up and rubbed his eyes, he noticed something odd. His sketchbook was open. He was certain he had closed it before sleeping. He always did. But there it was, flopped open to the mountain drawing. Only now, there were new details. His hand wasn't on the page. The sun had a face. The vines had turned into cartoon snakes. And at the base of the mountain in shaky pencil, someone or something had written the words, "The real you is hiding." Chris blinked, then blinked again. Then checked his door to see if Stewie had pulled one of his cerebral mischief stunts. But no wires, no cameras, no mutant clones with British accents hiding in the closet. Just his usual mess, a pile of socks shaped like Alabama, an unopened package of deodorant from last Christmas, and a suspiciously sticky action figure Meg had angrily thrown at him during a previous dinner argument. Still, that message was real. He touched the graphite with his finger. It smudged. Fresh. He closed the book slowly and muttered, "Okay, that's not terrifying at all." But deep down, he was intrigued. Someone or something was trying to reach out, through his drawings, through his subconscious. And unlike most things in his life, it wasn't mocking him, ignoring him, or trying to borrow money for weed. At breakfast, the family was too busy dealing with their own nonsense to notice the haunted expression on Chris's face. Peter had a bandage on his forehead and a second-degree sunburn on his arms. "What happened to you?" Lois asked, pouring coffee. "I wrestled a raccoon for control of a floating cooler." "We agreed to a draw," Peter muttered, eyes distant. "Name was Franklin. Smart little bastard." Brian was reading a newspaper and sipping from a coffee mug that said, "World's Most Pretentious Pet." Stewie was microwaving what appeared to be a jar of marbles. Meg was watching a live stream of a celebrity apology video while mumbling, "He meant it this time." Chris just sat at the table, quietly pushing cereal around with his spoon. Lois noticed. "Chris, everything okay?" He looked up, startled. "Huh? Yeah, totally fine. Just tired." "You sure? You look like you just found out your birth certificate was printed on a napkin." Chris chuckled softly. "I'm good, Mom. Just thinking." "Uh-oh," Stewie said, spinning toward him. "That's never a promising sign. What are you thinking about, Chris? Cheeseburgers that run for office? Left-handed rainbows?" "No," Chris replied slowly. "Just who I am." The room fell silent. Then Peter laughed, loud and sloppy. "Who you are? Buddy, you're Chris, the boy with the voice of an exhausted goose and the attention span of a squirrel on espresso." Lois winced. "Peter." "No, it's okay," Chris said. "That's just it. Everyone thinks I'm this weird mess of noises and weird drawings. But I think there's something else under that. Something bigger." Stewie raised an eyebrow. Define bigger. Emotionally? Spiritually? Mass-wise? Because mass-wise, we're already well beyond regulation. Chris ignored him. I'm going to figure it out, he said. I'm going to find the real me. Peter leaned back in his chair, burped, and nodded like a sage. Well, if you do find him, tell him he still owes me $20 from that time I bet you couldn't fit a pickle in your ear. Spoiler alert, you could. Chris left the house that day not entirely sure where he was going, only that he had to go. He wandered into town, sketchbook in hand, passing through Quahog like he was seeing it for the first time. There was the laundromat where Bonnie once threatened a man with a steaming sock. The gas station where Peter tried to marry a Slurpee machine. The alley behind the grocery store where he and Meg accidentally summoned a possum cult. All of it weird. All of it his. But somehow, not him. He ducked into a diner. It was one of those sad little places that smelled like syrup, tears, and a slight hint of bathroom bleach. The waitress greeted him with a nod that said, "I've seen worse," and led him to a corner booth. He pulled out his sketchbook and started drawing again. Not with a plan, not with a goal, just letting it out. He drew a version of himself wearing a cape made of comic books. He drew a small, shadowy figure inside his own chest, holding a flashlight. He drew Peter as a balloon floating away while Lois chased him with a frying pan. He drew Quagmire as a human zipper, and somehow it made sense in context. Then he drew a door. Just a simple door, right in the middle of a blank page. He didn't know where it led, but he couldn't stop staring at it. "What's behind it?" he whispered to himself. "Usually that means trauma," said a raspy voice. He looked up. An old man in a trucker hat was sipping black coffee at the next booth over. His beard looked like it had been grown out of spite. "Name's Marvin," the man said. "I watch people. You're one of the interesting ones." Chris blinked. Thanks?" Marvin nodded at the sketchbook. "You trying to figure out what's behind the door?" Chris slowly nodded. "It's you," Marvin said. "Every kid like you draws that door eventually. That thing they don't want to see but have to face. Sometimes it's fear. Sometimes it's truth. Sometimes it's just a pile of memories you stuffed under your mental bed like dirty socks. That sounds scary." "It is," Marvin said. "But that's where the good art lives. On the other side of the scary stuff." Chris stared at the door in his drawing again, then back at Marvin. But Marvin was gone. The booth was empty. The coffee still steamed. Chris shivered. "Okay," he muttered. Either that was metaphorical advice from a wise ghost, or Quahog just got way weirder. Chris walked out of the diner in a haze. The door to his sketchbook still burned into his mind like it had been etched there with a laser pointer in childhood confusion. He didn't even notice he'd stepped in a puddle until he was halfway across the street, and a truck honked at him for crossing during a red light. That felt about right. The universe was chaotic, reality was loose, and apparently Marvin, the diner ghost or possibly just a very underpaid philosopher, had just handed Chris a metaphor he couldn't forget. Back home, he locked himself in his room and cleared a space on the floor, kicking away socks, paper scraps, and a long-forgotten slice of pizza that now resembled a fossilized slipper. He pulled out every colored pencil, charcoal stick, and marker he had, along with a stack of fresh pages. No more waiting. He was going to draw what was behind that door. He didn't know what it was yet, but maybe, just maybe the act of trying would bring it into focus. And so he began. The pencil moved faster than he could think. His hand jittered like something was flowing through him. Not just his imagination, but memory. Emotion. Something real and honest. The lines came sharp and heavy. A hallway. Shadows. Faint lights. A sense of depth he'd never captured before. He didn't even realize he was crying until a tear dropped onto the page and warped the pencil strokes. But he didn't stop. He kept going until the hallway opened into a room. And in that room, at the center of the page, stood a younger version of himself, age 8 or 9, his childhood self, alone, standing in front of a crayon mural that looked suspiciously like the Griffin's living room. The kid in the drawing looked back at him. Not scared, just patient. Chris dropped the pencil. "What does it mean?" he whispered. Before he could even process the question, there was a knock on the door. Hey, Chris, you got a second?" It was Lois. Chris shoved the drawings under his bed like he was hiding a crime scene. "Yeah, just a sec." He opened the door. Lois was holding laundry and wearing that face she always wore when she suspected one of her children was having an existential breakdown, but didn't want to push too hard. "You doing okay?" she asked. "You've been quiet lately." Chris nodded slowly. "I've just been thinking about stuff." Lois hesitated. "About what?" "About who I am. About how... Maybe I've been pretending to be dumber than I am because that's what everyone expects. Maybe I've been hiding from stuff." Lois blinked. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't Chris asking if clouds had personalities or whether cows had opinions. This was her son talking from somewhere deeper. "I'm proud of you, Chris," she said, setting the laundry on his bed. "Even if you're still figuring things out. We all are." Chris managed a smile. "Thanks, Mom." She left the room. The door clicked shut. He sat back down, stared at the sketch again, at the kid version of himself. And then something strange happened. The drawn figure moved. Just a little, a twitch, a blink. Barely noticeable, but enough to make Chris jolt backward like he'd just sat on an electric fence made of childhood trauma. He leaned in. The sketch didn't move again. But something had changed. The door that once stood behind the younger Chris in the drawing was now open. Chris flipped to the next page. He drew again. Fast, wild, instinctive. This time it was a forest, twisted trees, a path that curved like it didn't want to be followed. Eyes in the shadows, and at the center, a cartoonish figure that looked a lot like Peter, except he was 20 feet tall and made entirely out of bacon. Chris blinked. "Okay, subconscious. Let's not go off the rails just yet." He flipped the page again. Drew a castle, but inside it wasn't royalty. It was his middle school locker. And inside that, a tiny version of Meg, locked in a glass box labeled "Do Not Engage." "Damn," Chris whispered. "That's cold." But the more he drew, the more it started to make sense. These images weren't literal. They were symbols, representations of how he saw the people around him, how he processed the world, and how his strange, cartoon-filtered brain tried to make meaning out of the chaos that was Quahog. And as the images poured out, so did the realization. He'd been told he was the dumb one for so long, he'd started believing it, started leaning into it. Being dumb was safe. Being dumb meant no one expected more. But now he knew better. Though Chris Griffin wasn't stupid, he was weird, deeply weird. Capital W weird trademark with a side of surrealism and a big gulp of adolescent confusion. But not stupid. He was layered, multi-dimensional. And, if he dared say it, maybe even gifted. Sure, he couldn't multiply fractions without a nosebleed, but he could see things others couldn't, feel things in ways that were too big for words, so he poured them into drawings. Strange, beautiful, twisted drawings that felt like dreams wrapped in a family circus panel. It was his language, and he was finally starting to speak it. Later that night, while the rest of the family was watching some disturbing Peter-made game show called Guess What's in My Shoe? Spoiler alert, it was sadness. Chris quietly walked down the hall and knocked on Stewie's door. The baby genius was at his desk, operating what appeared to be a machine made entirely out of dental floss and stolen microwave parts. "Ah, Christopher," Stewie said without looking up. "Come to confess your sins, or perhaps finally admit that your left nipple blinks when you lie." "No," Chris said seriously. "I need your help." Stewie turned. That got his attention. "Help with what?" Chris held out the sketchbook. "I think something's talking to me. Through the art. And I don't know if it's just my brain doing weird stuff, or if there's more to it." Stewie stared at the pages, one eyebrow raised. "This is remarkable," he said, flipping through the images. "There's a coherence here, an evolving structure, layers of metaphor and subconscious threading. And you drew Peter as a meat tornado, which I find both accurate and chilling. Chris nodded. So, am I going crazy? Stewie looked up. No, he said. You're waking up. Chris swallowed. Then what's behind the next door? Stewie smiled. Well, Christopher, let's find out. Stewie sat cross-legged on the floor of his room, scanning page after page like a paranoid CIA analyst looking for the start of a psychic war. Chris hovered nervously behind him, still clutching a box of Pop-Tarts as if it were a protective talisman. Stewie's tiny fingers paused on the page with the long hallway and the open door. This one, he said, tapping it. This is where it began. I drew that a couple days ago, Chris said, but I don't remember thinking about it. It was like my hand knew where to go. Classic subconscious bleed, Stewie muttered, eyes narrowed. Either that or you're being manipulated by a trans-dimensional entity posing as a diner hobo named Marvin. Chris blinked. Wait, that's actually an option? In Quahog? Stewie said. Yes, always. He dragged over a small device that looked like a speak spell duct taped to a Roomba and flipped a few switches. A soft hum filled the air. What's that do? It reads electromagnetic fluctuations in dream residue, Stewie explained, and also has a setting that makes toast. But I've disabled that one. I'm not trying to die from flying bagels again. The device buzzed angrily when Stewie waved it over the sketchbook. A red light blinked. Yep, definitely weird. Chris swallowed. So what do? We go in. Chris blinked. Go in? Into the sketch? Precisely, Stewie said, standing. I've got a prototype NeuroBridge headset. It lets us enter constructed dreamscapes. I originally made it to trick Brian into thinking he was adopted by werewolves. But now, it's perfect for this. A few minutes later, Stewie strapped the clunky headset onto Chris's head, then slipped his own on with a click. Wires connected them both to the sketchbook, which now pulsed faintly like a living thing. You ready? Stewie asked. Chris nodded. Let's open that door. Stewie pressed the button. The world went white, then stretched like rubber. Chris felt like he was being pulled through a funhouse mirror that had a deep emotional grudge against him. Colors spun, shapes twisted. Then, bam, they landed. They stood in a long hallway, the one from the sketch. Except now it was real. The walls were charcoal gray, like someone had drawn them with heavy pencil lines. The lighting was dim, like the glow came from within the paper itself. The air was still, but the silence was thick, oppressive even. At the end of the hallway, the door stood wide open. This is kind of beautiful, Chris whispered. Yes, Stewie said, also incredibly unstable. So don't touch anything that looks like it has feelings. They walked slowly, each footstep echoing strangely. Chris peeked into the open door. Inside was the sketch of his younger self, exactly as he'd drawn it, except now the kid was moving, spinning in place and humming the Gumball theme song. Little Chris looked up, smiled. Hey, he said, you found me. Chris stepped inside, heart pounding. What is this? He asked. The younger version shrugged. This is where you put me, a long time ago, when you got scared. Chris frowned. Scared of what? Of being seen, little Chris said. Of being different, of drawing weird stuff, of having feelings you couldn't explain, or ideas that didn't make sense to anyone else. You locked me here so you could be what everyone expected. Chris knelt down. His eyes were glassy. I didn't mean to. I know, said little Chris, but you're ready now. Chris reached out. The younger version took his hand and vanished into light. Chris gasped as warmth surged through him, like he was breathing for the first time. Damn, Stewie whispered from behind him. That was poetic. Chris turned. His voice was steady now. What's next? The walls trembled. More doors appeared, lined up like a gallery. Each one pulsing faintly with light, each marked with a different symbol. A fish, a broken clock. a melting face, and one that looked eerily like Peter's butt. "Oh, boy," Stewie muttered. "This is your inner world, all right?" Chris pointed to the clock door. "That one." "Bold choice," Stewie said. "Might be time trauma. Might be a metaphor for puberty." 50-50. They stepped through. Inside, they found a classroom. Chris's old middle school, frozen in time. The desks were crooked. The chalkboard read, "You'll never be good enough," in spidery handwriting. In the corner sat a younger Meg, arms crossed, staring blankly at the wall. "Chris?" she said without turning. "Yeah?" "I hated this place. You did too. But you smiled through it. And I always wondered, why?" Chris stepped forward. "Because if I didn't smile," he said softly, "I'd cry." Meg turned to him. But this Meg wasn't bitter or sarcastic. She looked tired. "We survived," she whispered, "but I never healed." Chris reached for her hand. "You still can." She vanished, just like his younger self. Stewie clapped. "Wow, we are 2 metaphors away from a Pixar deal." Chris turned. "This is real, isn't it? Like emotionally?" Stewie nodded. "Absolutely. Also possibly medically. The dream interface is glitching. We should probably wrap up before you get stuck in your own trauma maze." The hallway shimmered again. A final door appeared. It was the one Chris hadn't dared to draw yet. It was blank, untouched, but something behind it waited. Stewie held up a hand. "This one's on you." Chris stepped forward, hand trembling, and opened it. Inside was a studio, massive, cathedral-like, filled with easels and canvases. It was overflowing with drawings, sketches, paintings, things he hadn't even made yet. Visions of future emotions, future stories, possibilities. In the center was a mirror. Chris approached slowly. In the reflection, he saw himself. Not younger, not cartoonish, just Chris. Older, maybe, more centered, confident, still weird, still Chris, but whole. He smiled, and the reflection smiled back. Then everything dissolved. Chris and Stewie woke up on the bedroom floor with a collective gasp. The headset smoked faintly. "Well," Stewie said, blinking, "that was either a spiritual rebirth or a really weird episode of Inception. Special ed." Chris sat up slowly. "I feel good." Stewie nodded. "You should. You found your core identity, battled metaphorical guilt, and forgave your inner child. That's more progress than Peter's made in 40 years. Chris stood. "I'm ready." "Ready for what?" Chris sat alone in the attic, knees tucked against the wooden floorboards, as shafts of golden afternoon light cut through the dusty windows like gentle searchlights. The sketchbook lay open in front of him, its pages fluttering slightly in the breeze, as if eager to be filled again. For the first time, he didn't hesitate. He didn't worry about what would look cool, or what others would think, or how it would be received. He just started. The pencil moved like it had been waiting years to be used this way. Lines flowed effortlessly, not from his mind, but from someplace deeper, someplace older. He drew swirling dreamscapes and floating staircases, tangled vines that morphed into crying faces, a laughing moon cradling a heart made of keys. It wasn't just drawing, it was a purge. Each line untangled a knot. Each shadow lifted a weight. Downstairs, the sounds of the Griffin house carried on with chaotic familiarity. Peter yelling at a broken blender, Lois chasing Stewie through the living room with a spatula, Meg asking Alexa to play Lana Del Rey, and getting a weather forecast instead. But Chris wasn't in that world right now. He was somewhere else, somewhere only he could go. 3 hours later, his hand finally slowed. He blinked, not even realizing how long he'd been working until the ache in his wrist caught up with him. The final drawing was complete. It was strange and sprawling and abstract, but it was him. And that was enough. He stood up slowly, brushing pencil dust off his palms, and descended the attic ladder with newfound purpose. He didn't fully know what came next, but he knew he couldn't hide his work anymore. It was time to show someone. Someone who mattered. "Hey, Mom," Chris said, entering the kitchen. Lois turned from the sink, surprised to see her son clutching a sketchbook like it was a sacred text. "Hey, sweetie, what's up?" "I want to show you something," he said, voice steady but low. "I've been working on it." He handed the book over. Lois dried her hands, then sat at the table and opened the sketchbook gently. She turned each page slowly, silently. At first, her brows furrowed, concern, maybe confusion. But as she kept going, her expression softened. Her lips parted slightly. Her eyes grew glassy. "Chris," she whispered, "this is beautiful." Chris swallowed. "You really think so?" Lois looked up at him, her eyes full of quiet pride. "I think you've created something honest, something brave. These aren't just drawings, honey. They're you." Chris blinked rapidly. "I thought it would be too weird, or stupid." "No," Lois said, shaking her head. "It's raw, but that's what makes it real. You've got something special here, Chris." He sat down across from her, breath trembling. "I didn't know if I should show it to anyone, but I think I have to." Lois nodded. "Then you should." Chris hesitated. "There's an open mic thing at the community center tomorrow night. It's for spoken word and art. Some of the weird theater kids go. And you want to be part of that?" He nodded. "Yeah, I think I do." Lois smiled gently. "Then go. Be weird. Be loud. Be you." The next night, Chris stood behind the curtain at the Quahog Community Center, wearing his best flannel shirt and holding a rolled-up version of his sketchbook under one arm. The small theater smelled faintly of old pizza and ambition. The walls were plastered with hand-drawn flyers. Expression explosion in Comic Sans, glitter hot glued onto the corners. On stage, a girl named Eliza was performing a slam poem about being haunted by her reflection in Zoom calls. The crowd snapped their fingers rhythmically, clearly loving it. Chris's palms were sweating. His name was next on the list. "You okay?" A guy with turquoise hair and 3 eyebrow piercings asked, glancing over. Chris nodded. "Yeah, just nervous." "You got art?" "Yeah, drawings." The guy grinned. "Awesome. Be weird with it." The MC called his name. Chris stepped out under the lights. The room was dim, but the spotlight was blinding. Dozens of eyes stared back at him, strangers mostly, but with an energy that wasn't hostile. Just curious. He unrolled the drawings and pinned them to the easel on stage. Then he turned to the mic. "I'm Chris," he said. "I drew these, and I want to talk about what they mean. Because for a long time, I didn't know how to say what I felt. I only knew how to draw it." He pointed to the first image, the spiraling stairs wrapped around a falling figure. "This one's about fear, the kind that makes you shut parts of yourself away, the kind that makes you act like someone you're not." He moved to the next one, a tree with roots that turned into broken mirrors. "This one's about my family. It's weird, chaotic, and messy, but it's where I come from, and it's part of me." As he kept going, the room stayed quiet, but not in a bad way, in a listening way, a leaning in way. Chris felt his chest rising and falling steadily. The fear was still there, but it was fading under the warmth of expression. "This last one," he said, pausing on the dreamscape of floating islands and melting clocks, "is about what happens when you stop hiding, when you let yourself feel things, even if they're weird or loud or embarrassing. Because sometimes the weirdest stuff is the most honest." When he finished, the room was still for a second. Then someone clapped. Then a few more. And then everyone. The applause rolled over him like a wave. Not massive, not deafening, but real. He stepped down, face flushed, and the turquoise-haired guy gave him a high five. "Dude," he said, "that was killer." Chris smiled. Not the forced, awkward smile of someone trying to fit in. The real kind. Back home, Chris laid the sketchbook on his shelf beside his old video game trophies and a signed Kenny Loggins CD he never had the heart to throw away. The attic wasn't a hiding place anymore. It was a studio, a launch pad. Downstairs, Peter was trying to fit an entire jar of pickles into the microwave again. Stewie was muttering Latin spells under his breath while wearing Meg's makeup. Brian was deep into a self-help book he wouldn't finish. And Meg was crying while watching The Notebook in reverse, convinced it was more emotionally impactful that way. And yet, amid all the chaos, Chris sat at the top of the stairs with a pencil in hand. No, not hiding, not running, just drawing, just being. Because sometimes finding yourself doesn't mean changing who you are. It just means being brave enough to show the world what's always been there. The following days moved slowly, like the calm after a personal storm. Chris found himself walking differently, shoulders relaxed, eyes forward. He wasn't arrogant or overconfident, just balanced. A quiet kind of contentment had settled over him, like he'd finally caught up with a version of himself that had been waiting patiently all along. At school, a few classmates who'd been at the open mic approached him, not to tease, but to talk. Some asked if they could see more of his art. Others just nodded in acknowledgement, as if silently admitting that maybe there was more to Chris Griffin than anyone ever bothered to look for. Back home, the atmosphere remained predictably chaotic, but something had subtly shifted. Lois started asking more questions about his drawings, about what he was working on. Even Peter, in his own ridiculous way, started bragging about my son, the tortured genius, to anyone who'd listen, even if he barely understood what the term meant. Stewie, of course, remained his usual cynical self. "Ah, yes," he said one morning, glancing at one of Chris's surrealist sketches on the fridge. "Very Dolly meets disturbed toddler. Truly evocative." But even Stewie seemed to take an interest, and from him, that meant something. Late one night, Chris sat back in the attic, the room still smelling faintly of old crayons and sun-warmed wood. The stars outside were unusually bright. He was working on a new piece, not because he felt pressured to, not for validation, but because he wanted to, because it helped him breathe. And then, somewhere around the fourth page, he paused. He thought about what came next, about the attention, the spotlight, the opinions. He knew they could be fleeting, that people who praised you one day could forget you the next, that art once shared was no longer fully yours. But he also knew something more important now, that whether the world watched or didn't, applauded or didn't, he was an artist. Not because someone said so, but because he chose to be, because his voice didn't need permission to exist. He smiled to himself, and he kept drawing. Down below, the Griffin house groaned softly in the wind, a lighthouse of madness and memories. It would always be noisy. It would always be weird. But now Chris could meet that chaos with something stronger than retreat. He could meet it with truth, with color, with line, with him. Because sometimes the loudest thing you can do is simply not hide anymore.
The attic was quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't just mean a lack of noise. It meant something had settled. Chris had found a rhythm, not just in his sketching, but in his thinking. Days passed like softly turning pages, and for the first time, life wasn't a storm constantly threatening to wash him out. But then, something strange started to happen. It began with whispers. Not literal whispers, not ghostly murmurs in the attic walls, but the subtle kind. The kind of whisper that floats in through the behavior of others. First, it was Peter. "Hey, buddy," Peter said one morning, walking into the kitchen in his usual underwear and wife-beater ensemble. "You ever think about drawing like real art? Like naked mermaids fighting space dolphins? That could be huge." Chris blinked. No, he said, cautiously buttering toast. "But I'll think about it." Peter grinned. "That's my boy. Make me rich. Also, I signed your name to a merchandising deal with some guy named Rocco behind the bowling alley. Hope that's cool." Chris barely had time to process before Lois swooped in. "You know, sweetie," she said sweetly, "your drawing of that little lost astronaut was really moving. I showed it to the church book club. Now they want you to paint a mural on the rectory wall, preferably something about salvation or tea parties, whichever feels less satanic. Meg chimed in from across the room. Do me next. Like a sketch of me as a misunderstood vigilante who eats judgment for breakfast. Okay, Chris said slowly, a little overwhelmed. It was as if the Griffin household had collectively realized they'd been sleeping next to a magic well this whole time. And now that it was bubbling, they wanted a sip. Chris, ever the quiet sponge, took it all in with his usual good-natured nodding. But inside, something was stirring. He'd opened a door, and the wind that rushed through was not all fresh air. The next wave hit at school. "Yo, Griffin!" yelled Neil Goldman across the hallway, holding up a poorly stapled comic book. "I tried drawing like you, man. Check it out. Neilman versus the Virgin Vampire League." "Cool," Chris said with a wince, flipping through pages drawn entirely in glitter pen and jealousy. "This is a lot." "I was inspired," Neil said proudly. "You're a revolution." Even Principal Shepard pulled Chris aside in the hallway. "Listen, kid," he grunted. "If you ever feel like drawing a new school mascot, one that doesn't look like a pervert raccoon, we're open to ideas. You got raw edge." Chris chuckled politely, unsure whether to feel proud or terrified. But the real unraveling began later that week. Chris had entered a zone, a kind where art bled into dream and dream bled into movement. He began drawing obsessively, filling sketchbooks in hours. Things he didn't even remember thinking about came pouring out, vivid, bizarre, beautiful things. A smiling cactus holding a severed cable remote. A moose in a therapist's chair, crying about his mother. Lois with angel wings made of baby monitors. Each sketch was personal. Not in the obvious sense, but they felt like pieces of himself. And yet, they seemed to speak to everyone. People started texting him at all hours. "Can you draw my breakup? Can you draw how it feels when your dad never says he's proud? Can you illustrate shame but make it marketable?" It wasn't just praise, it was demand. It all crescendoed the day Quagmire showed up at the front door. "Hey, Chris," he said, holding up a large folder. "I've got some, let's call them grown-up concept pieces I need visualized for a very tasteful, very European publishing project. And don't worry, there's a banana for scale in every frame." Chris blinked. Why are they all in hot tubs?" Quagmire winked. "Because I believe in artistic integrity." Chris shut the door slowly, not saying a word. By now, he was feeling less like a person and more like a vending machine for everyone's unmet emotions. They all wanted his lens. They all wanted to be seen. But no one seemed to care if he disappeared in the process. And the irony? It wasn't malicious. It wasn't even intentional. People were just drawn to light when they saw it flicker. Even moths can't help themselves. But somewhere in the rising chaos, Chris began to feel that flicker dim. He hadn't drawn for himself in days. Not really. Every time he picked up a pencil now, he thought about who was going to see it, what they were going to expect, how it might be interpreted. The freedom that had cracked open his soul in the attic was quietly giving way to performance. He sat alone in the backyard one evening, trying to sketch something, anything, that wasn't laced with invisible strings, but his hands wouldn't move. "What's wrong with me?" he whispered. And that's when Stewie appeared, sipping a juice box and wearing tiny aviator sunglasses like a retired toddler rock star. "Burnout, dear brother," he said coolly. "It's like puberty for the creative soul. Awkward, painful, and full of questionable urges to destroy your own past." Chris sighed. "I don't want to stop drawing. I just don't know how to do it without feeling like I'm doing it for someone else." Stewie considered this, dramatically removing his sunglasses. "Then you must do what all great artists do when they lose their way," he said. "What's that?" Chris asked. Stewie leaned in, deadly serious. You must self-sabotage until the weight of your own despair creates a new form of expression. Or go on a weird vision quest. Chris blinked. I'll try the second one. Smart choice, Stewie nodded. Less jail time. And just like that, the next phase of Chris's journey took form, not as a rise to fame, but as a descent into the strange and surreal, into his subconscious, into the weird little nooks where identity isn't forged by applause, but by confusion, confrontation, and very possibly a talking dog dressed as Sigmund Freud. Because what's the point of being understood by everyone if you no longer understand yourself? The next morning, Chris packed a bag, not with clothes, but with blank sketchbooks, extra pencils, and a peanut butter and jelly sandwich shaped like a UFO. He didn't exactly know where he was going. He just knew he had to leave the house, and more importantly, the noise that came with it. Stewie handed him a flashlight, a compass, and a box labeled Emotional First Aid. Inside were Band-Aids, a juice box, and a stress ball shaped like Peter's head. Be brave, Stewie whispered, dramatically saluting him like a soldier departing for battle. And if you see your inner child crying, give him a juice box. It works 9 out of 10 times. With that, Chris stepped out. He wandered the woods behind Spooner Street for what felt like hours, then cut through forgotten trails, past discarded shopping carts, and into a place no one visited anymore, the old quarry. Silent, fog-laced, forgotten. It looked like a dream on pause. He sat up there, atop a rusted-out truck half swallowed by nature. Chris opened his sketchbook and waited. And waited. The sun dipped low. The wind whispered things that sounded suspiciously like, "You are weird, and that is your gift." He didn't know if he was hearing nature or his own brain, maybe both. Then it happened. Not inspiration, not a thunderbolt of genius, but a single line. Just one pencil stroke across the page, crooked, uncertain, and meaningless to anyone else. But to Chris, it was a start. It didn't feel like performance. It didn't even feel like expression. It felt like breathing. Then another line. Then a curve. Then an eye. Not a cartoon eye, but an unsettling, honest eye. Then a tree with veins. A cloud shaped like regret. A shoe full of water and memories. Chris didn't even realize he was crying. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't joy. It was release. The kind of silent breakdown that doesn't shatter. It melts. When he looked at the page, it wasn't just art. It was a question. Who am I if I'm not trying to make anyone else understand me? The answer wouldn't come that night or the next, but the fog in his head was beginning to clear. And somewhere deep inside the quarry, as the stars blinked awake above him, Chris Griffin, awkward, gentle, frequently dismissed, was doing something extraordinary. He was learning to draw again. For no one. For everyone. For himself. There are moments when silence feels louder than sound. Chris sat in the fading mist, the quarry glowing beneath a silver moon. His drawings had started as instinct, but now they were becoming different. Stranger, honest. Each stroke wasn't just a sketch. It was memory, emotion, fear, and humor, twisted together like vines around his pencil. Somewhere between pages, he'd lost track of time. Not in the usual ADHD way, and this was deeper. Chris was sinking inward like each drawing was a door. He'd sketch a figure and forget if it was someone he knew or a reflection of himself. He drew a crooked house with a mother inside who looked like Lois, but also like a flamingo. A couch with a man who looked like Peter, but his body was melting into the cushions as if he'd been sitting there for 40 years straight. And then came the weirdest sketch. A mirror. Just a mirror. Plain, uncracked. In the middle of a forest clearing. And it blinked. That's when things got hazy. The real world, the wind, the dirt, the scratch of a pencil on paper, seemed to fall away like sand from a dream. Chris blinked again, and suddenly he wasn't in the quarry anymore. He was inside his own sketchbook. The pages were massive around him, torn paper cliffs, ink rivers, eraser-dusted valleys, trees with pencil-shaded leaves, clouds made of charcoal smudges. And in the middle of it all stood that mirror. He approached slowly, breath fogging in the suddenly cold air. Chris stared into it, expecting a funhouse reflection. Something goofy, stupid, maybe a little cruel. But what stared back wasn't funny at all. It was himself. But older. Like way older. Not gray-haired old, but emotionally older. More weathered. Still him. Still soft around the face. But something behind the eyes had changed. There was sadness there. But strength, too. Wisdom earned through something. And this older Chris spoke. "You didn't come here to draw," he said softly. "You came to remember who you were before the world told you to be someone else." Chris frowned. That sounds like a thing I'd see on a mug at Meg's therapist's house. Older Chris smiled. Yeah, well, even mugs can tell the truth. Then the mirror cracked. And suddenly, memories came flooding in. Not events, but feelings. All the times Chris had been called stupid, fat, slow, weird. Not in big, dramatic ways, just tiny slices. The way teachers sighed when he raised his hand. The way Peter looked at him like he was a booger he couldn't flick off. The way Lois spoke to him like a toddler with a head wound. Even Meg, the punching bag of the family, still got to roll her eyes at him like she was better. But here's the twist. Those moments didn't hurt the way they used to. Chris felt something unexpected. He felt forgiveness. Because he saw them for what they were. Not weapons, not punishments. Just projections. The people around him had never figured out how to understand him, so they made him smaller, simpler, goofier. It made them feel less uncomfortable, less afraid. But Chris wasn't here to carry their discomfort anymore. He was here to draw. And suddenly, the sketchbook world shifted again. Now he stood in the Griffin living room, but everything was paper, origami furniture, a fireplace drawn in crayon, and his family. Oh boy. Paper Peter stomped around loudly, his limbs flapping like cardboard cutouts. "Hey, Lois, I taught the dog how to moonwalk with his butt. Watch this." Paper Lois floated by on a wind current, sighing. "Peter, I swear, if I find one more raccoon in the dishwasher." Paper Stewie was holding a tiny bazooka made from a bendy straw. "Victory is mine, unless the ink runs again. Blast it, Meg." And there, sitting silently, was Chris, the paper version of himself, just watching. He stepped closer. "Hey," Real Chris whispered to Paper Chris. "Do you ever feel real?" Paper Chris looked up. His eyes were huge. "Only when I'm alone." And that's when it hit him. Even within this paper version of his life, where everyone was reduced to two-dimensional jokes, he still felt like the flattest one in the room. Not because he lacked depth, but because nobody ever tried to read past page 1. Real Chris knelt down, touching the paper floor. "That's gonna change." Suddenly the scene shattered, like someone ripping the page right out from under him, and he was back in the quarry, gasping, hands shaking, tears in his eyes, but smiling. Because now he had purpose. He flipped open his sketchbook, found a blank page, and wrote, "I'm not stupid. I'm just not loud enough to drown out everyone else's noise." It wasn't poetic, it wasn't even that good, but it was his. Chris closed the book and stood up. The sky above was glowing with pre-dawn light. Birds chirped somewhere nearby. The wind was soft, warm, real. As he walked back home, shoes crunching against the gravel, he felt taller. Not physically, but spiritually. Like some piece of his spine had grown back. Back on Spooner Street, the house was still asleep. Peter snored through the walls like a dying engine. Meg was probably rage texting her therapist. Lois would wake up soon to make passive-aggressive pancakes. And Stewie would probably build a clone of Chris with worse posture just for fun. But Chris didn't feel invisible anymore. He felt grounded. And right before he entered the house, he looked up at the sunrise and whispered, "Thanks." He didn't know who he was thanking. The mirror? His older self? The weird drawing forest inside his own head? Didn't matter. Because this time, the gratitude wasn't performative. It was quiet, sincere, real. And Chris Griffin was finally learning how to exist in a world that never gave him room. By drawing one for himself. The Griffin house smelled like syrup and despair. Chris walked in quietly, hoping to preserve the clarity he'd just earned. That sunrise had done something to him, not in a cheesy, movie-ending kind of way, but in the real tender sense of quiet beginnings, like the world might be less loud today, or at least he might be less lost in the noise. But peace never lasts long in Quahog. "Chris!" Lois's voice sliced through the hallway like a broom handle through the drywall. "You were gone all night?" Chris flinched. His sketchbook was still clutched to his chest like a sacred relic. Before he could answer, Peter stumbled out of the kitchen wearing a bacon bib and one sock. "Hey, is this about the raccoon in the fridge again? Because I named him Sebastian, and he has rights." Lois ignored him. "Chris, you can't just disappear. What if something happened? What if you were abducted by a cult again? Or worse, what if Stewie cloned you and made a better version?" Chris blinked. "I just needed to be alone. I went to the quarry to draw." That should have explained everything, but in this house it was like saying, "I went to Neptune for coffee." "Draw?" Lois blinked, confused. "You mean like with crayons?" Stewie peered around the corner with an espresso cup and one suspiciously human-sized mousetrap. "Heavens, Mother, give the boy some credit. He's evolving beyond pudding." Meg glanced up from the couch, expressionless. He was probably just drawing boobs in the dirt again. "No," Chris shouted, louder than intended. "No, I wasn't. I was trying to understand myself. I had to go somewhere quiet." The room fell weirdly still. Even Brian, who'd been licking peanut butter out of an iPad case, stopped mid-slurp. Chris took a breath. "You guys all see me as this big, dumb kid who eats glue and cries during infomercials. And yeah, sometimes I do. But I'm not just that. I have feelings, thoughts. I see things nobody else seems to notice. I draw because it helps me make sense of things. Because it's the only time I feel like I'm not invisible." Lois blinked. "Well, Peter looked stunned. Holy crap, did he just monologue?" Meg muttered, "Okay. That was kind of deep." And Stewie, somehow both touched and jealous, murmured, "I should have written that speech." Chris didn't wait for their reactions to settle. He just walked past them, calm, notebook still tucked in his arms, and climbed the stairs to his room. It was time to change things. His room still smelled like old socks and chili-flavored regret, but now it felt like a studio. He opened the windows. He stacked his sketchbooks in order. He even labeled his pencils, dreams, fears, memes, and aggressive ducks. Then he started to draw again, not like before, when he was just sketching for fun or therapy. This was something else. He was building a world. Every page was a window, every drawing a room. A weird town of imaginary people who looked just enough like the Griffins to raise questions. A city where talking bears managed bakeries, and shy giants ran poetry nights under bridges, a dimension where his feelings had their own zip codes. And at the center of it all was Chris, not the Griffin version, not the ha-ha, he's so dumb version, but Chris as he saw himself. Awkward, yes. Soft-spoken, yes, but creative. Deep. Funny in weird ways. Capable of love. Capable of being loved. He didn't show anyone these drawings yet, not even Brian, who offered critiques like, too much shadow, try less pain. Not even Stewie, who offered to market your sadness to the French. This world was for him. Still, Family Guy doesn't let anyone be serious for too long. One night, maybe a week after the quarry trip, Chris fell asleep at his desk. Pencil in hand, sketchbook open, drool forming a small lake near page 48. He dreamed again. But this time it wasn't the sketchbook world. It was his family, but different. They were all cartoonish still, but this time they were his cartoons, his designs. Peter had wheels instead of legs. Lois had a crown of clouds. Meg was a giant floating eye with a journal. Brian was a typewriter that barked. And Stewie? He was a mailbox that shot lasers. And yet they felt more real than ever. In the dream, they gathered around him looking at his drawing, not mocking, not laughing, just observing. Peter rolled up. Hey, buddy, this stuff is weird, but kind of beautiful. Lois smiled. You got your own world in there, don't you? Stewie raised his mailbox lid. I shall conquer it immediately. Chris looked around, stunned. You guys don't hate it? Brian nodded slowly. Nah, you're making sense of chaos. That's kind of noble. Chris felt himself cry in the dream, but the tears were stars, and they floated upward into the ceiling, where they lit up constellations shaped like memories. And when he woke up, he didn't feel embarrassed. He felt seen. The next morning, Chris did something he hadn't done in a long time. He came down for breakfast and brought his sketchbook, not to hide behind, not to fidget with, but to share. Lois was flipping pancakes with maternal intensity. Peter was wearing pajama pants with bacon stains that could have qualified as historical artifacts. Stewie and Brian were embroiled in a debate about which one of them would be most likely to survive if they were both trapped in the microwave. Stewie had data, Brian had wine. And Meg was eating a granola bar like it owed her money. Chris stood silently for a moment, then cleared his throat. I want to show you guys something. Peter blinked. Is it a waffle shaped like Danny DeVito again? 'Cause I'm still recovering from the last one. No, Dad, it's something real. He held up the sketchbook. Lois turned, lowering spatula. Is that the one you take everywhere? Chris nodded. Yeah, I finished something. I want to read it. Like out loud? Meg said, her granola bar halting mid-crunch. Yeah, Chris said, nerves bubbling under the surface. I wrote and drew this story. It's kind of weird, but it's about me. All the versions of me. The funny ones, the sad ones, the ones that just want someone to understand them. He sat at the table and opened the book and began to read. The story was about a boy named Crandall, a quiet, awkward kid with a head shaped like a light bulb and a soul shaped like a tangled pair of headphones. Crandall lived in a floating town made entirely of things people threw away. Rubber ducks, expired coupons, VHS tapes, love notes that never got delivered. In this town, Crandall wasn't mocked for being slow or strange. In fact, he was the mayor. His job? To give discarded things new names and new lives. An old shoe became a ferry boat. A broken umbrella turned into a dragon's wing. A melted action figure became a hero with a soft voice and a fireproof heart. And the people of the town, talking lamp, Singing cactuses, bears in bow ties all loved him. Not because he was the smartest or strongest, but because he saw things. He noticed the stuff everyone else ignored, and he made it beautiful. When Chris finished, the table was silent. Lois had tears in her eyes. Peter looked halfway between proud and confused, like someone had just told him he was the father of jazz. Meg looked stunned, like she hadn't expected her brother to have an inner world that didn't involve fart jokes and spilled glue. Stewie just stared. And Brian? Brian nodded slowly, genuinely. "Damn," the dog said. "That was good." Peter coughed. "I didn't really understand all of it, but I liked the part where the refrigerator married the blender." "That was a metaphor," Chris said. "Hot," Peter said. Lois reached over and put her hand on Chris's. "Honey, that was beautiful." Chris smiled shyly. "Thanks, Mom." Meg actually leaned forward. "Can I read it later?" "Yeah," he said. "It's weird, though." "Good. I like weird." Even Stewie offered a grudging nod. "You got vision, Griffin." Terrifying vision, but vision nonetheless. Chris sat back in his chair and let it wash over him. Not praise, but understanding. For the first time, they weren't seeing him as a background character in their loud lives. They were seeing him. The messy, sketchy, awkward, brilliant version of him. He ate his pancakes that morning with maple syrup and confidence. Later that day, Chris took a walk to the library. Not to borrow anything, just to sit. He found a quiet spot under a skylight, pulled out a fresh notebook, and began to sketch again. Not because he needed to prove anything, just because it made him feel whole. As he doodled a scene of Crandall riding a skateboard made of toast, a quiet voice spoke beside him. "Is that your own story?" Chris turned. A girl about his age stood nearby, holding a stack of graphic novels. She had blue-tipped hair and a backpack covered in pins, some funny, some political, all loud. Yeah, he said, nervous. "It's kind of a surreal thing. Doesn't really make sense." She peered at the page. "That toaster's crying," she said. Chris nodded. "It's mourning a dream." The girl smiled. "That's kind of dope. I'm Ivy." "I'm Chris." They shook hands. She sat beside him and opened one of her books. And there they sat, two kids, in a world that often didn't understand them, scribbling weirdness and heart onto pages, side by side. Chris didn't know what this was. A friendship? A meet-cute? The beginning of another emotional subplot? Didn't matter. For once, he wasn't chasing the moment. He was just in it. Somewhere back at the Griffin house, Peter was probably breaking a trampoline while trying to surf a mattress down the stairs. Stewie was possibly halfway through building a particle accelerator with cheese sticks. Meg was probably being ignored. Lois was likely on the phone with Bonnie, venting about Peter's recent attempt to make a bathtub chili dispenser. Brian was writing angsty poetry no one asked for. And that was okay. Because Chris had finally found something for himself, a space between the chaos, a frame inside the noise. He wasn't just the weird kid anymore. He was the artist of the discarded, the dreamer of the surreal, the boy who turned his pain into castles and his silence into symphonies. And as the sun poured through the skylight and lit his sketchbook in warm golden hues, Chris Griffin, awkward, tender, strange, and shining, smiled, because, for the first time in his life, he didn't need anyone else to tell him he mattered. He already knew.